All right, so we're live. So part of the basically we have a lot of cards that we're going to cover, and it's covering all the major cycles with all of the set except for roughly 10 cards being spoiled. I feel pretty comfortable about doing a generalized set review, the impact on constructed, because we know most of the context that all these cards are going to operate under. Yeah, we may see a similar situation like with Ikoria, where Yorion was dumped on the last day of the spoiler dump, and that card turned out to be a pretty significant to have a pretty significant impact on constructed Magic as a whole. So we may see a card or two like that, but generally speaking, most of the cards that are going to be released tomorrow, the remaining 10, are going to be commons and uncommons of relatively low impact. So I think it's like pretty reasonable to try a set review here. So the format is basically going to be I have a list of cards that I think are pretty interesting to talk about, and we're just kind of gonna go one by one and check from there. So one sec. It looks like something happens.
Yeah, and I mean, based on some of the cards that we've seen already, it definitely looks as though they've at least tried to learn their lesson, especially with the companion mechanic going the way that it did.
Oh yeah,
Um, it's not as easy to errata um, the entire side of a card. So,
right.
and I think some of that is reflected in some of the dual face cards that we've seen. They're they're definitely not automatic slam dunks like some people thought. When Luris was first revealed, um, people were like, how is this not going to see play? you know I think
Exactly.
you can make an argument for all of these cards to see play, but also to not see play. So you know I think they're actually a lot more interesting than what we were given before, especially with the new sort of mechanical space that they're exploring here. And so we'll go through them.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I actually am totally in agreement with that. Initially, when I saw the double face mechanic of the spell land duality, it was only on a couple of cards that we had seen, and I feel like it's a mechanic where the fewer options that you give to players, the more broken in a sense that that mechanic is, because the opportunity costs are very different when you only have 3 cards of that mechanic versus, say, 50 cards of that mechanic. And so I was a little bit concerned that we weren't going to see it as too deep of a mechanic, but now that we've seen almost the entire set, there's a lot of the double-faced cards, and I like how they've pushed a kicker and a lot of other things. And one of the interesting things too with Zendikar that I think is important for understanding is they do design these sets pretty well in advance, but generally speaking, they can sneak cards in within anywhere between a 6 month and a 1 year window. They did that with a braid in the past into Hour of Devastation. So this could be one of the first sets where they've actually responded somewhat to community feedback about how much people disliked the big power push. So it's possible some of these cards may have been changed super late, or they may have snuck cards in super late to kind of interact with some of the more steadfast mainstays of constructed Magic. So
Yeah, and I think we might even be just seeing that even with a card like what is it, confounding conundrum?
confounding conundrum, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems like too perfect of a card in response to the current state of standard in particular, to almost not be like, was this an inclusion later that they just kind of snuck in, or was it something that they were just like, we're going to Zendikar landfall, obviously. We just want to check on the ramp. It's one
Right,
of those
right.
things where you ask, is this kind of one of the kind of things that they're slipping in? But
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense because one of the things that I was on the lookout for when looking at Zendikar Rising in terms of evaluation is looking at the amount of ways that you can kind of cheat by putting extra lands into play, and there's actually not very many. There's not much ramp in terms of like creatures that put lands into play. There's like not much ramp in general. So it's really interesting to me that that card is actually in the set because even though we have landfall, I think landfall in this set kind of works a little differently than it did in the prior Zendikars. You know, the prior ones you had like a bunch of different cards that like let you put lands into play. Like we had the one like pump spell in Battle for Zendikar where it was like give a creature +2/+2, like you know, like shenanigans like that. So and this set has it has some, you know, it has like the mini Uro card in here, and there's like something where you can sack a land to put two lands in place. So there are like a lot of ways to do it, but it's by no means like the focus of the set. So I think them putting that card in is yeah, really interesting. It might have been something that they snuck in to handle Uro. Maybe they suspected that Uro was something that got like significantly better in general with rotation. You know, so it's yeah, that was a card that really stuck out to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could go on for probably a couple hours about Uro of itself.
Oh
So
yeah,
try not to get on that topic too much.
yeah,
But yeah, it's definitely it's definitely interesting some of the cards that we've seen, and especially coming off of I think just the whole year, you know, in general since War of the Spark, you know, it's kind of been it's kind of been crazy.
yeah,
Just the whole world in general, and for Magic especially, it's been one of the more turbulent times.
yeah.
So,
I I I
you know,
I, I think this would have probably, you know, I've been playing Magic for an incredibly long time, and you know, ever since I was a little kid, and I think this is probably like the most powerful like year, like consecutive 12 months that Magic has really ever been in as a state. It's really quite astonishing how many cards from 2019 and 2020 are in competitive decks, and I don't mean that in a bad sense. You know, I think it's great when when even older formats mainstay decks actually have a lot of newer cards in them, but it's like pretty dominant. So it's always really interesting, I think, evaluating sets with the context that we might just be in the most powerful year of Magic.
yeah, and I mean, just look at even you can even look at Pioneer as a format. You know, when Pioneer was introduced, and even up until the most recent bans, most of, if not all of the top decks, just straight up win conditions came from the last year. You know,
Right,
Healing,
Oko and
you know, Thassa's Oracle, all
right,
of those cards alone. You know, there's obviously, you know, you had cards like Inverter, which were, you know, printed long ago,
yeah,
but really the cards that broke those decks, you know, and
right,
broke these cards, you know, they came out relatively recently.
yeah,
Even, you know, you can make an argument, you know, for Kethis, you know, too.
right,
You
yeah,
know, a card that's kind of pushing that boundary that we even saw in Standard when it came out. That I believe they even had kind of said that they didn't actually intend for the combo to come out. Like
right,
that it was not something that they saw in playtesting.
yes,
So you know, it was it's something very interesting that the kind of direction they've been pushing some of these cards in. So, and I think you could even make an argument for the most recent Jace from War of the Spark. You know, kind of a card that kind of looks inconspicuous at first, but here we are in Pioneer with a deck that managed to use it to really great effect. You know, it turns out that no matter what the card is, if it says win the game on it, um, people might find a way to potentially break it in
yeah.
some
And I
way.
mean, there was a lot of graveyard decks too that I was fiddling with in like standard when that card came out, where that card was just like great. Like 4 mana planeswalkers that draw you a card are like usually reasonable in even in like middle range power level standard formats in general. So you know the floor is going to be pretty low on that type of card. I or going to be pretty high on that type of card anyway, but like the ceiling of winning the game is obviously pretty exceptional. And we did actually, prior to the printing of Thassa's Oracle, there was like some deck lists combining Inverter and that Jace together, but they were generally speaking kind of janky and things of that nature. But yeah, absolutely, you know, the that entire format, prior to Oko being banned in it and like Field Net and whatever, was obviously dominated by cards that had been printed in the fall of last year, and then they kind of banned those cards, and we saw the evolution of the format go moving into Theros, where Theros like just completely defined the format by itself. Like, you know, Lotus Field was a good deck that got pushed over the top by Underworld Breach. You know, Inverter got Thassa's Oracle, which like made that deck, you know, into like the de facto like go-to best deck in the format. You know, it won almost every major big events. And then also we got Heliod and Uro, which were format defining in other ways, and the only kind of remnant left of that is Uro itself, which is kind of taking over every format at this point. So yeah, I mean it's we've had Magic largely defined by even in a greater sense the entire last year, but you know less so more about since last fall, which I guess at this point is approaching the year prior to that. But
Yeah,
War of the Spark was kind of the turning point for many formats. For example, with Narset, Teferi, Karn, things of that nature. And we didn't really see the power level decline from there, but I know you and I have talked a lot about the power levels in Magic, pushing the boundaries of card design in general, them taking risks and stuff like that.
yeah.
And what I like about analyzing formats with you in particular is you don't really stick to any particular platitudes. You kind of approach everything with new context, which I think is really the only way that you can be approaching Magic right now. It's so radically different than it was prior to 2019 that we kind of have to approach every set, I think, within the context of Magic currently, rather than comparing too much to what it would be in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy that we went from a format, just a few years ago where Chain Whirler was talking about being banned from Standard and Chain Whirler.
Yep.
And here we are with a long list of bans of cards that arguably if you showed somebody those cards and they had no context of them, they'd be like, when were these cards printed? 15 years ago? Like sort of like eternal formats, your brainstorm type of cards,
Yeah,
once upon a
exactly.
time, you know, cards that are just like, how could you like print this nowadays? And it's very interesting the sort of the direction that's been taken, and but we can talk about that all day. So
Oh yeah.
if you want to go on to the whatever card we want to start with here,
Yeah.
we can kind of dissect it a little bit more and kind of elaborate as we go through.
Yeah, I think that's great. So the ones I was going to start with are, basically at the top of probably everyone's set evaluation is the mythic double-faced cards, the cycle of these big, powerful sorcery spells that have untapped lands on the back side. And I kind of want to talk about the cycle as a whole, and I think which ones are going to see plays. So, um, there's one for each color. Obviously, it didn't double dip. I actually think they're all like pretty reasonable, but
I agree.
and I that's actually a trend I think I'll kind of bring up for most of the set, as you had alluded to earlier, is what separates this from like the companion mechanic or like Uro, like Escape in general, is these cards aren't obviously like busted, right? So it requires a lot more evaluation, I think, for this set than prior sets, which obviously makes for more interesting. And I'm okay if cards see a lot of play, and a lot of play for me would be, oh, it's a one of in like a couple different decks. I think it's better for players to be playing a lot of different cards within decks rather than just being forced to play, oh, this card is going to be a four of good. So what I like about these mythics is I don't think too many of them will be like three or four ofs, right? They're expensive to actually fully utilize.
Yeah, and the cost is very real on these. It's very interesting to the extent of, especially in eternal formats, I think is where it's going to be really interesting to see how far these actually get pushed in terms of playability. In standard, obviously, you know, they're great, but in
Yeah,
we start getting into formats like modern and things where you're already shocking every turn, and now if you're playing a deck like Death Shadow, are you replacing your swamp, that you play and
right?
or in your island with the new mythic and taking more damage? Obviously, Death Shadow is kind of a deck that wants to take the damage, but even a deck like Jund, especially with the new Izzet deck going around that's so burn heavy, it's really interesting. I'm really glad that they kind of, especially on these mythic ones, they didn't make it two. Um,
Yes,
I
yes.
really like the three. That it really feels like a decent cost for them.
Yeah, so Mark Rosewater actually alluded either earlier in the week or last week that they're experimenting with more untapped lands in general, and that was I believe it was in reference to the dual lands in the set in general, because you can argue that those dual lands are better basics, and in a sense they are, but we know from playing Pioneer and from playing modern and even older formats like Legacy and Vintage, basics are really, really good in a lot of circumstances. Obviously, in modern, there's actually a lot of blood moons running around, and you always want to make sure that you have a basic you can fetch out against a Path to Exile or a Field of Ruin. And so these lands, you know, as you mentioned before with 3 life, it is a real cost. Say for example, if I'm a blue-red deck, and in a perfect world, I could put 4 of the blue one and 4 of the red one in my deck, and get a bunch of free value. But if I'm losing 9 life at the start of the game to play my first, 2 or 3 spells, that's a pretty significant cost. And in a lot of ways, modern has kind of a format that's defined by that in a lot of sense. Your 3 color decks oftentimes start the game at 14 to 16 life, for example, and there's a lot of cracking a fetch land for a tapped land in modern that comes up as well, because the life resource matters. I do.
Exactly. And, obviously effects like Blood Moon and stuff, you kind of get to the point almost like interestingly enough, like where it's like where are you cutting lands to actually fit in these new ones? If
Exactly.
the kind of card that you want, are you starting to like actually cut on fetch targets and things like it's a very interesting ceiling, especially in modern, that we're getting towards of like such high quality lands that you almost have to pick and choose like what you kind of have to choose your pros and cons almost now, which is a lot more of an interesting decision than I play my fetches, I play my shocks, and I play my 3 basics,
Yeah.
in case I get Blood Moon. It's very interesting to see like maybe some decks, maybe some Azorius control type decks move more towards, playing less shocks and playing,
I mean,
some of these ones where they don't come in, do damage, save some life.
right?
It's some things like that. Very it's just a very interesting point that we're getting to. There's just so many good lands
Yeah.
in Eternal formats, and in regards to your point of the fact that they're better than basic lands, it's kind of like an interesting dynamic because in your hand they're obviously better, but on the field they're just as good. You know,
Yes.
they're
Yes.
they're the essentially the same as a basic. So it's such an interesting question in terms of like these dual face cards that they're very tricky to evaluate. It's going to be one of those things that people really got to play with. They got to play with them in action to really get a hold of them because um, it's it's one of those things where it's a big new territory, and it's
Yeah.
very hard to conceptualize in an actual game of Magic.
Yep. And I will say too, like, I appreciate mechanics that make deck building more interesting, because I do think there should be a lot of success, and there is a lot of success in not necessarily knowing a format, because I think formats should be very approachable for new players, and that's where the advantage of being able to take a list and do well with it is. But I do think that this type of mechanic gives a little bit more of a push towards players that maybe specialize in an archetype or learn a format really deep, where they understand the minutia of differences between the different land choices you make. And we could see entirely new archetypes spawned because now you have more land options. Like maybe you see blue white control just not play a card like Celestial Colonnade anymore. Like maybe you see decks play more lands, because some of these count for the lands. And in a way, I think that this mechanic kind of makes deck building more interesting, which has something that the last few sets really haven't done as much. And in general, I'm a player that when I deck build, I usually have one more land than a lot of other players would have, because I think in general it's really good to hit your land drops, because we keep getting more and more stuff to do with our mana.
Yeah. And I
Um,
mean, it almost gets to the point where you can ask the question, maybe I'm not even cutting lands for my dual
Maybe
face
I'm
card.
cutting spells, right?
Maybe I'm cutting a spell, because in the option, I'm increasing my land count, which is obviously good, in terms of just hitting your land drops, but also it's not a dead draw later on.
Right.
It gets to this interesting dynamic where it depends on how you want to think of it. Is it just a land card? Is it a spell card? They're not just cut and dry good enough to where it's like, I'm gonna run 4 of this.
Yeah, like
I don't even care how much damage I take, you know?
look at Shatter Skull smashing. Do I really want to pay 3 or 4 mana for that effect normally? Not really, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of where they're all lying. Where they're, if it was a spell, I don't know too many people that would just be putting most of these spells
Into their
in
decks, right?
the traditional deck. There's one in particular I think might be. There is one I think is better than the
The
others,
green
but
one?
it's not actually.
Oh,
It's not the green one.
is it the black
I
one?
do think the green one. It is the black one.
Okay.
I think the black one is very good.
I think so too. I really
I
like the
don't know
black
about a
one.
standard format, but especially in Pioneer and maybe even a potential modern deck, I think it is a very, very good card. That is, I could actually see some decks paying for that effect to some degree, especially if it comes with a land. You know,
Yeah.
that one in particular, I think is
I
really strong. But the green one, I think they're all very good cards. Like the white one also
mhm.
can see a lot of play just to make dudes, and swing on in a deck that wants to do that. Or maybe it doesn't even have another win condition. It uses lands as a win condition in standard.
I mean, it's better than Castle Ardenvale in a lot of games.
So, that's where a lot of it is. But again, we get to that point where is that 3 damage, is that too much to ask? And I think a lot of this is going to depend too on what happens. Not to go back to it, but what happens to Uro? Because um, it's a card that does mitigate. That kind of cost, especially in a standard where the aggro decks right now they have a hard time punishing these kind of Uro decks. They just don't have the same punch that they do in other formats.
So there's a I for me the black and the green ones are up there on like the ones that I think are the two to be on the lookout for most. Just in general, like across Magic formats as a whole. Though I do think I agree with you that they're all quite good. There's a couple specifics that I wanted to touch up on these cards before we move on to the next set of cards.
No, of course.
So I think with the particular mythic ones, I think there's more of a tension when you get into older formats between how valuable basics are and the tension of it's so you're less likely to be able to use the spell part of this card in those formats in general. So
Yes,
there's
yes.
a tension between like the upside of the card and the drawback of the card that you don't really see in standard. In standard, I think it's far easier to justify playing 3 to 4 copies of these cards, because while yes there is a significant cost to them, um, the format in general is slower than a format like Legacy or a format like Modern. So I think it's far more interesting in those formats to see how people kind of fit them in because yeah, as you mentioned before with Death Shadow, you can't exactly like cut a fetch or cut a shock in a lot of circumstances, and you can't cut your basic either. So it'll be really interesting, I think, in those formats where the probability of you getting to say 6 or 7 mana to be able to utilize your cards, these cards effectively, is pretty minor, and you're less incentivized to play 3 to 4 copies. So if you're only playing 1 copy of Agadeem's Awakening and you have to play it on turn 1 to Thoughtseize your opponent, well, you're never getting access to that card.
Yeah.
Later in the game because you're probably not playing a second copy. So I do think there's tension in other formats with these cards, and I do agree that I think the black one is very good. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it. It also is a card that is kind of free in some of the Lurrus decks in Pioneer in particular, and it also like is kind of a combo enabler in a sense for certain modern decks and stuff like that. So it's a like Gruesome Menagerie is not a modern playable card, right? But if that Gruesome Menagerie doesn't have to take up a spell slot, it's
Yeah.
probably a playable card, right? So
And that,
I think that's what makes the black one pretty good in my eyes. Is it's one of those ones where you're more likely to be able to justify playing 2 to 3 copies of it. I think.
yeah, it's really good because I mean, I think I speak for everyone here when I say I don't think we need another completely format warping mechanic to come to the game. I think we've already been through enough with what happened with the companion stuff.
Yeah.
Just kind of the fallout of all of that. I mean, it's just crazy. I think they definitely took a hard look at these cards after, and they're like, if people are going to be playing with these, we want to make sure that either they're extremely slow, which some of them are, like the blue one in general,
And the white one,
where
yeah.
you gotta you gotta grind it out, where it's going to be more likely in standard and things where that's generally where these cards should be extremely powerful. And if you do end up playing four, or so of these lands, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure that there's some decks that take advantage of you know the spell side of these much more effectively than others.
Yep.
And you know, in a standard cycle, you never know what you're going to get, especially with them sort of planning ahead. And we might get things in sets down the road that kind of fit in well with these spells. That you know, it's never easy to discount something that you can essentially play for free.
Right. Right.
It's very hard to discount it. It's all going to come down to how much that three life is going to matter a majority, most of the time.
Right.
And so that's what we're
So
going to have.
from a mathematical perspective, if I'm playing four of these lands in my deck, um, I would assume that I'm going to pay three life once every other game for these lands, which I think is a pretty reasonable assumption because you're going to have in your opener like 40% of the time. Generally speaking, you need to use all the lands in your opener usually. So I think most of the time you're going to pay about 1.5 life to put a copy of this to put these cards in your deck. Which I think is pretty reasonable, but yeah. So aside from that, um, the reason I don't think the green one is the most powerful one in terms of effect. I really don't. I think it's either the red or the black in terms of that.
Yeah,
But I think the green one is the most free to include in decks. And
yeah,
because,
definitely has a very generic effect that's just very good.
right. So,
Or
not,
I mean, for cost, that's really like for seven, it's really it's kind of a lot in the grand scheme. But for a free effect, we've seen like even Yorion seeing play where you got to pay three and then five.
yeah, that's
For
totally
something
fine, right?
and we've seen that work out. And Yorion essentially costed five when the companion was free. So these
Correct.
effects that are costing five, six, and seven, in the context of like people were saying, oh, Yorion costs too much for modern. The card won't see play. Clearly, there's a threshold where free things are worth
Oh,
some level
absolutely.
of cost.
So,
No matter how good or bad the effect is.
I think I think that's even more so with cards of this type of mechanic that are green because typically a 7 mana green spell oftentimes is more like a 5 mana spell in a lot of other colors. It's a lot more manageable to pay 7 mana in decks that are green because it's the color that gets access to mana ramp, which as we've seen, like most mana ramp that's competitively viable is oftentimes in the form of stuff like land war elves or explore type effects where it's pretty cheap to actually accelerate your mana. So yeah, exactly. It's free consistency to the color that wants it the most, and the color where it can justify paying 7 mana the most. I think so. And it's also the green decks tend to play more lands on average. The exception would be like your blue white decks. Control decks also play a lot of lands, but your green decks tend to play more lands anyway. So they're more likely not only to be able to have more room for this type of effect, but they also want a lot of untapped green sources. So I think in general it's easier for green to utilize these expensive sorceries. So that's why I think the green one is potentially dangerous in certain formats. Like I'm kind of worried that it's a little too good in terms of consistency for say a format like Pioneer or Standard, where there's some pretty good green creatures you want to get in general. And like I don't I don't know that I feel comfortable as a player who may want to play aggro knowing that my opponent could have 8 copies of Elder Gargaroth in their deck.
I mean, when you
So
have mono green as one of the best decks right now in Pioneer,
right, right.
four of those,
Look,
and it's
that
an effect that just adds more consistency to a deck that arguably can get a lot of lands out and a lot of mana pretty quickly.
right. So I
It
wanted to touch up on mono green in Pioneer. So that's a deck where it does matter that these aren't forests, but it matters a lot less because oftentimes how that deck loses is you kill their first two payoffs and they just have a bunch of shitty mana dorks and they can't really kill you with that. So, that's a deck where they kind of want more to do with their mana because they have so much mana generation that they want the ability to, oh, you've killed my planes, you've thought seized me, and then you've countered my planeswalker. Well, I only play like 12 real cards in my deck, so I need some way to mitigate it. And they play a lot of basic forests, so you actually have the ability to just play 3 to 4 of the Turn Timber Symbiosis without really affecting your forest count too much.
Yeah.
So yeah, the early list I drew up for that, I think I had 3 or 4 in it, and I think I played one Ashaya main deck because it's a way to increase your forest count for Nissa draws that you can find off of your Turn Timber Symbiosis. So there are ways to mitigate cutting your forest as well.
I mean, it's just it's one of those things. Even like with the some of the we kind of saw it with the companions where people were debate. We're getting to this point where it's like, is Yorion worth adding the inconsistencies? Is it
Right.
worth and Luris? Is it worth cutting you off from these things?
Is
And
Giganta worth not playing Brazen Borrower, right?
exactly. And a lot of the times it really did turn out that when you're able to consistently do things in Magic, it's very good.
Yep.
Like it's usually a very, very good thing to be able to do things. I know, shocker,
Right.
but we've been shown that if even if it's kind of if it seems like there's a negative to it, usually the positives of being proactive and being able to do things kind of outweighs that drawback.
So, uh, one of the in mentioning having things to do being good, one of the criticisms I've seen of the red one of these is that it's pretty weak on its face half. And which you can't really say as much for the 7 mana spells, right? They feel like 7 mana spells. Turn Timber Symbiosis is very similar to Vivian's Invocation. Amaria's Call is like pretty similar to like the white of Finale or whatever, where you make a big board effectively for 7 mana. And Seagate Restoration like also feels like a really 7 mana spell, even though oftentimes you're not going to be drawing a ton, but that's fine.
Yeah,
But the red one itself like doesn't scale particularly well until you hit 6 mana. But it, like the green one, is also in the color that can play it the most free, I think. And what I think the red one has that the others don't have is it actually has utility on turn 4 or 5 of the game. So Ifnir
yeah.
Deadlands
I
was,
I mean,
very
I think
standard
just
playable, right?
in general, that X value is really, really surprised. I'm surprised they put an X mana cost on a land. That in of itself is pretty surprising to me. I think the red one is definitely, on its face value, is pretty weak. But the fact that, like you said, you can use it, to at 3 on 4 on 5, and that's just an option that you have is just it's absolutely crazy to me. So it's I definitely feel like the power level of the card in an actual game of Magic, it definitely has game with the other ones.
Oh,
It's very powerful.
I think it's one of the top. But it's
They're
it's
just
it's
all like
one that,
they're so good. That's why
well,
I
yeah.
love them so much. It's just I'm really glad that they didn't make it like, oh, you know it comes in for 2. I'm really glad they made it. That's my big thing. I'm really glad
Yes,
that we're not
yes.
staying at the Shockland and you don't
Yeah,
get
that
that
it's a
bonus.
real
You don't
cost.
get the you don't get the extra color, but you get the spell side. I'm glad that we're moving more towards this. If you want to make these choices, um, it comes with a cost because obviously with companions and everything, uh, giving up a sideboard slot is not a is not a con, and most of the deck restrictions for the good companions were not enough
Yep.
because people will find a way to make these cards work.
All right. So, um, feel like we've talked pretty at length about the mythic cycle. I could talk like way more about
I
them.
know.
I
Yeah,
love that cycle so much,
no,
and
I agree with you. I'm
um, but there's
very
there's
happy with it.
there's far more to this set. It's a really
Yep,
interesting set.
it is.
So hopefully we don't have to spend as much time on these. These really shouldn't take that long to talk about, I think. Is the dual lands I want to talk about next. So, first, a little bit of context. We have 6 of them in this set, and we are getting the next 4 soon, according to Mark Rosewater. So, presumably in one of the upcoming standard sets, we will get the other 4 of these. So, this will be a completed cycle, likely within a year. I would assume maybe Kaldheim or Strixhaven gives us the others. So we will be finishing these out at some point. But personally, I was ecstatic to see these lands, and I know a lot of people are kind of dumpstering on them. But I actually helped curate a custom card format for a couple of years, and we had very similar lands to these, and I actually like them a lot. I think these lands are actually very, very good. I think they're almost Shockland level good. Um, I like
I
them a lot.
I really like them a lot too. I can understand people's grievances with them from just a face value, but they really are. And that's the thing is these dual lands work the same as any other dual lands. In some decks, they're going to work better than others.
Yes.
In some, we're going to have decks where in standard, maybe the scry lands are actually beneficial to you. Maybe obviously the shock lands are kind of the gold standard. I think is what you could call it for standard lands. But even the check lands and things like that, they come with a very interesting dynamic of that they can be both, but you got to make a choice. And once the choice is made, you're stuck to it.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a very interesting dual land that adds a kind of a nice twist that we haven't that you kind of don't get from other dual lands. Um, it's almost sort of in a sense kind of a spiritual successor to the fetch lands in a way. You know what I mean? In the
Yeah.
sense
Well,
that
because the fetch lands without shocks are effectively these lands, right?
exactly
You know.
that's why it's so interesting to me is that they're kind of very similar to that, but obviously they're not the fetch lands.
Yes.
And but in the context of in a format where if you had fetch lands and basics, I mean, what's the difference between this and that format?
Exactly. So
It's
one thing I wanted to bring up with these lands is they're in many ways, I think they're comparable to checklands like Sulphur Falls or Rootbound Crag. In that if you're playing a 2-color deck, they're pretty comparable to those cards. They're effectively the same type of dual land, but there's obviously tension between like these lands can give you whatever color of the side you need on turn 1, which I think is substantially more important for aggressive decks than most dual lands typically are. And the other thing too with the lands like these is Sulphur Falls is pretty close to equally good in a blue red deck as it is in a blue red black deck as it is in a 4 or 5 color deck because it's very easy to utilize one of the colors of mana. These lands do get a lot worse when you're playing 3, 4, or 5 colors, but I do think when you're playing 3 colors, it's totally fine to play like 10 or 12 of these in standard, because you're going to
yeah,
have enough density that you still get to pick your colors. So they do get a little worse in decks that are uh, very color pip heavy that spread across a lot of different colors. But even in Pioneer, I haven't really found that to be an issue in terms of early deck building, and I'm actually ecstatic that decks like Dimir Control or Naya Winota or Arclight Phoenix get extra dual lands that aren't check lands because the check lands can be a little cumbersome in a format where Thoughtseize or Wild Slash can be so important. So I understand the criticism of these lands, but I think I love them. They're probably some of my favorite lands ever made, and not only do they make for some interesting deck building evaluation because you can't quite evaluate them as a full black and a full white source, but you sort of can. So they again they make you think about deck building a little more, and I like it when cards give you choices in game. I really like that.
yeah, and I mean, it's really like one of those things where it, I mean, you know me, I love to play with powerful cards. I love when standard is, you know, very high power level to a fair degree. But do we really want another land that's just like, oh, this is another land that I'm going to throw into my modern deck because it's just better than the ones that we've had before.
Exactly.
Prefer when we get cards like these that actually have benefits and a downside.
Yes.
In a three-color deck, yeah, these aren't as good than, your Steam Vents, your Stomping Grounds, but, that's not a bad thing.
No,
That
it's
doesn't
not.
make these cards bad, and that's the beauty of them and why I'm really glad that they printed them, and I'm really glad they didn't make them come in tapped or
Oh
anything.
yes,
That
and
if
I.
they made them come in like that, I'm really glad they didn't
Yes,
like.
I'm happy
Uh,
to see for standard in particular untapped dual lands that feel like they're about as good as fast lands in terms of the format. I'm also happy that I don't have to worry about my lands coming in tapped at any point in the game with these. And I think the other thing too is I'm so excited that we're getting the other four pretty soon. So because
and
I,
I do
I I want the other four like right now. I want the red black one. I want there's other ones that I want. So
and I do like that these kind of they do have a more aggressive slant to them. I
yes,
feel like we
yes.
haven't really gotten very good lands for these kind of multicolor aggressive decks.
Well, it's
Um,
it's tough from a theoretical perspective designing dual lands for aggressive decks, though.
yeah, it is,
Because entering tapped isn't really an option, so you've limited a lot of the upside you can put onto lands because you can't just print like a volcanic island card, right? It's hard to print a dual land that's better than steam vents, right? Like and you can't just put steam vents in every format. That's like pretty boring, right? In every standard format. That's pretty boring, I
yeah.
think. So it's a lot harder, I think, design-wise to design good and interest. Well, you might not even care about interesting if we're just talking about we want good, diverse um, lands for aggressive decks. It's a lot harder, I think, because again, you can do scry lands, you can do all kinds of enter the battlefield tapped effects with different upsides for slower decks. But untapped dual lands are a lot tougher to design. So I'm happy to see an aggressive slant. I think.
Like, oh, if the red black one was around with Amonkhet standard, where we had the fast lands, and we had this and the check lands at the same time.
Welcome
Oh
to
man, that
Pioneer.
would, yeah. I mean,
So
I think that these cards will definitely help aggressive decks in Pioneer because those is kind of some of the best options for aggressive decks in
yeah.
that form.
So one thing I wanted to bring up before we move on is I do think lands like these are also interesting for decks that are primarily one color and splashing a second, for example. If you're a red green deck, but you're very very heavy green, this is kind of a free dual land to include, whereas something like Rootbound Crag would not be, because
Yeah.
most of the time you're going to want to make this a red land, but occasionally you'll want it to be the green land, and then it doesn't matter that much that you have one less red mana in the next turn. So I like them a lot, and I'm releasing a big deck dump of updated Pioneer decks tomorrow on like the Patreon, and I'll put some in the Discord and stuff. But I've put these lands in a ton of Pioneer decks, and I think it's the correct call for a lot of them. Even some of the
Mm.
slower decks, like the Fires of Invention decks, where oftentimes you just want your untapped lands until turn 4, and then it doesn't really matter if they come in tapped anymore. So it's just really important for those decks, like and so that's why you see those decks not really fiddle around too much with like the castle cycles, because they mostly just want lands that come in. They can play like a tap land on turn 1, but then they can't really play any more for the rest of the game. So I've put lands like these in some of the slower decks for a similar reason, because you can't really justify playing a tap land on turn 1 if you're a Thoughtseize deck. And the slower decks oftentimes don't need they don't get well they don't get punished as much for having a bunch of semi basics in play, because their cards work differently. They don't have to play things on curve. And a deck like Fires of Invention, for example, may only matter that they get their first red, because after that point they've unlocked everything else. So I've put these in
Yeah.
a lot of decks, and I think it's the correct decision for a lot of different decks. And I'll be very happy to see where these lands go, and I'm excited to work on some more standard decks. I'm not going to go quite as hard into standard as I ordinarily would for a rotation, just because it doesn't really matter as much right now because of the state of things in the
Yeah,
world.
and
But
um, rotation obviously comes with it a completely new cycle. We're losing a lot of key cards,
oh
so
yeah,
the
you know,
it,
but you know me, I like to go really hard on.
I know how you like to go. pretty
So
much expect these cards in some way, some shape or form in every format. They're they're a great alternative to lands that we've seen. Um, and it's just a great new land type. I
yeah.
wouldn't be surprised if they did it again, like
Oh
in
yeah.
some variation with the dual face. They do some other stuff, So yeah,
All right, so now we're going to move into individual cards. So we spent a lot of time talking about those two cycles, which I think deservedly so. I think there's a lot to say about them, but there's also a lot of just standalone, not necessarily powerful but interesting cards in Zendikar as a whole. And actually, most of the mythics make the list of cards I want to at least briefly talk about. So the first one I have up is Ancient Green Warden. That wasn't on the preliminary list I sent you, mostly because I forgot to put it on. But it's a card that I think deserves a few words. Now the main thing with the mythics, typically with these types of set discussions, is most of the time mythics don't need as much discussion because they're the cards people are talking about the most. But I do think it's worth bringing a little bit of the context with them. So Ancient Green Warden is a super unique effect, and thank God Field of the Dead is banned in most formats. But
oh, yeah,
aside from that, in terms of how it fits into Zendikar, it triggers all your landfall twice, which is interesting. But it also how this works is it lets you letting you play land cards from graveyards seems like whatever, but you can actually play the back half of all of these double faced cards with Ancient Green Warden. Um, so I can cast Shatter Skull Smashing, or even better, I can cast Turn Timber Symbiosis, putting an Ancient Green Warden into play, and then I can play the back half as a land from my graveyard. So
yeah.
so
It's
it's obviously really cool in the context of standard and limited, but it's also a summoner's pack target. And sure, you could summoner's pack for like Ramunap Excavator in older formats, but this is a bigger, beefier body that you can conveniently cast off of Castle Garenbrig.
I mean, we've seen cards kind of in a similar vein, the big green, that have powerful effects, and some are hit, some are miss, but this one definitely got a lot of text on it.
Yep. I
A
don't
lot of
think you
text.
play like four, but it seems pretty free to
Yeah,
play like one copy or whatever
yeah.
in a lot of decks.
Even as like a summoner's pack target and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
just playing it as a one,
Or a traverse target in Pioneer, for example. You know,
that would be real spicy with that one.
yeah, like a 6 mana 5/7 is relevant in newer formats as well. So, like
I
we've
think it's
seen
really,
Cavalier, right? Like going Cavalier into this is like pretty reasonable value in Pioneer, I think.
I think it's really going to come down to how much you can take advantage of the triggered abilities.
Yes.
Uh,
You only
we're
need
gonna
to
have to
trigger
see
it
it.
once, though, I think, for the card to be worth it in general.
But we need effects that are good enough on their own that don't need to be, you know,
Right.
don't need to be
I mean,
triggered an additional time to be good.
if we're being honest, in Pioneer, Tireless Tracker makes it like,
Yes, yeah, yeah. I'm
like,
talking in the context of
but
playing standard.
yes, I mean there are some landfall effects that are like potentially pretty decent with this card. I think in standard, being a 6 mana 5/7 has more merit on its own, but it's not quite enough to make itself playable because we have a card like Coglaw that doesn't really see any play and is arguably a better stat line than this, right? So yeah, you need to be utilizing uh, this card's effects, right? The body is nice, but you do need to be utilizing it for its effects. But that being said, I think it has some potential. It's at the very least, if green decks in standard end up relying on Turn Timber Symbiosis, it's fine to put like one copy of this card in your deck because it works really well with that card.
And I mean,
So,
this card is much more significant than triple your green mana.
well,
Uh,
yes.
Something along those lines that we've seen of big beefy green cards in recent times, kind of fitting that kind of the EDH mold.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is more in line with like Coglaw or Cavalier of Thorns, where they're cards that don't like consistently see like 3 to 4 of play in standard, but they pop up every now and then, and they're always something that you consider. So, and I think that's a healthy spot for a card like this. I think, but I'm just happy Field of the Dead is gone.
I think. What is it? It's banned in like every format now,
Yeah,
right?
it's legal in
Modern yet.
Legacy and Vintage.
not been in modern yet.
and not modern, but it's very good in modern and it's very good in legacy. So,
I would
um,
rather it be banned in modern
well,
personally,
I,
but
I I would as well. Uh,
you know, that's a another discussion for another time. So
yep. All right. So moving on, we've got one of the cards that was hyped up quite a bit just because it's super unique is Leyline Tyrant, and I personally am not the biggest dragon fan in the world. I don't really care that much. But I love cards like this. I like, it's not crazy pushed in terms of like survivability like Rekindling Phoenix was. It doesn't, immediately come down and actually do something. Um, but it is kind of a threat that it doesn't like take over the game when you immediately untap with it, right? But it does kind of threaten the opponent pretty quickly, and it kind of somewhat mitigates removal. So I like the fact that it doesn't just come down and immediately dominate the board state, but it still is impactful enough that your opponent has to care about it.
yeah, I mean this obviously this card is not Glorybringer in regards to the kind of design mold.
Right.
Uh my
It's
thing with
more
this
like
card,
Wilderness Wreck, right?
it's just yeah, it's more along those lines, but obviously putting on a creature is much easier to deal with,
Yeah.
but this effect is really really strong. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a very hard card to evaluate. It's going to be one of those things where even if this card is bad, if you're playing on arena, you're going to lose to this card and you're going to be like I couldn't do anything. You
Well,
can lose to this single card.
look, let's just say these two cards here, Leyline Tyrant and Shadow Skull Smashing, go pretty hand in hand. I think in at least in standard, I think it's pretty easy to play the two very well together. So,
Yeah,
um,
and I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think exactly. Do you just put this in any red deck
well, you
and
you can't really put it in any red deck, but I think Leyline Tyrant fits like pretty well into a lot of red decks. It's a good card, and I think we'll see it in Pioneer a little bit as well. Not so much for the you don't lose red mana as much as the fact that your opponent really only has one window to deal with it, right? And sometimes they don't have any window, right? Like if it's turn 5, you can just play it there and hold up a red mana, right? So and if your opponent kills it, they take. So I think in that vein, you know, I I I would be surprised if this card did not see a good amount of play, right? And I don't
yeah,
think you necessarily need to be abusing the fact that you can store up 5 mana on the next turn, right? I don't think that matters that much. It's just
that's the thing
you know
too is I don't I don't know. It's such a weird thing to even think about of like the effect. It's you read the text, but then you think about it in the context of the game, and you're like, wow, that's so crazy. It brings about it's it. This one's very hard for me. This is a very it's clearly like a strong card, but to say how strong it is, like people knew Wilderness Reclamation was a strong
but how
card.
good, right?
How good, and
Yes.
clearly, and I think it's been shown that even in as we're getting the card in Pioneer, and it's really like coming to see even in Modern, where it's like, yeah, I mean, the card's pretty strong. Is this card as good as Wilderness Reclamation? I don't think so, but
Well,
it
I
doesn't
mean,
take much to break a card,
yeah,
as
the I
Explosion and Wilderness Reclamation. There's ways to break these things, and this is the kind of effect you can break.
Yeah, I think one of the things a lot of people are kind of forgetting about this card is in order to store up 5 mana, you have to also not do anything, right? So, and that's
Yeah,
different than like Wilderness Wreck, right? Where you like part of what made Wilderness Wreck so powerful and dominant is you get to do stuff and then still do more stuff. Leyline Tyrant doesn't give you that option, right? So,
yeah,
oftentimes if you can sink 5 mana storing up with Leyline Tyrant, you probably didn't have anything to do with that mana anyway for most constructed decks, I would say. Most constructed decks don't typically play 6 drops very often, right? So, um, but on the other hand, maybe you play Shadow Skull Smashing in your deck so you can store up 5 mana, untap on turn 6, and cast this immediately for like X is 9 or whatever, and or even X is 8, completely wrath your opponent's board. on turn 6, and that's something you couldn't do with Shatter Skull Smashing before that. So I do think it is important to note it's a lot harder, I think, to break this card than a lot of other cards because it doesn't give you the option to do more things. It gives you the option to do things in a different way, if that makes sense.
Yes, it's not a wilderness reclamation style thing where, oh, if you play enough cards that you can cast on your opponent's turn, then clearly it's just free stuff. It's a different way of gaining some sort of advantage without doing things, and that's where it gets very ambiguous. Is
Yeah.
in the sense
Oh,
that it's
I,
kind of a free resource in a sense of like I'm not doing anything with my mana, but I have the potential to if you're answering my 4/4. You
right.
know,
But
it's
if they're answering your like the other thing too is like if you're storing up all that mana, you also just have a 4/4 flyer they didn't kill, right? So there's also like that part to it.
yes.
And you can't you can also um like the ability of Leyline Tyrant to win the game on its own is relevant as well because you just sink more red mana into it, right? So that I think is like I think the really powerful aspect of this card is if your opponent misses their window on turn 4, they're taking 5 or 11 damage potentially the next time they kill it,
I mean,
right?
I don't think that you can underestimate just 4/4 flying for 4.
Well, yeah,
I
that's
mean,
what I'm saying. Is like a lot of the times they're gonna have to kill this anyway, right?
exactly. I
But
mean,
and if they don't kill it, then you have a 4/4 flyer that hits them for 5 or 11 or 15 eventually. So yeah, I mean, so I do think a card like this is worse because it's on a 4/4 body, if that
oh,
makes sense.
I mean, if it was on an enchantment or something,
It's obviously
you
significantly
know,
better. But if this was a 4
yeah.
mana 2/2 flyer, I think the card is better in the way the game. Well, it's not a better card, but it's easier to break if that makes sense. Because your opponent is less likely
Mm,
to kill it. Because they don't have to kill it as
yeah.
early. It's also easier to kill for you because you can block a weak creature and trade off your 2/2 and trigger the effect. So it's one of those cards where I think 4/4 is an interesting stat line for it.
Yeah, it definitely warrants an answer, not only for its ability, but the stats that it brings on is, you know, sometimes they never even kill your Rekindling Phoenix and you just hit them with it 4 times and they die, you know? Sometimes you don't even need it to die. You just need a four damage in the air.
Yep. And that's especially in standard. That's a stat line that you kind of have to respect. So this is also a
Yeah.
card that actually can kill Uro, like can kill the Uro player faster than Uro can kill you, right? Because you
Yeah.
just store up all this red mana. Eventually, you block their Uro and they die, right? So, all right. So, I like that card a lot. I think it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. This next one, I'm actually not really a fan of, and I will be very happy if I'm wrong about this card. But I've seen a lot of people that are kind of hyped about this card. There's some obvious people who are bringing, oh, it's like Death Shadow, or some people are like this is kind of like Tarmogoyf. And this one is Scourge of the Skyclaves, the Black Demon Mythic. Part of the reason I'm not super high on this card is because it's very difficult to control these effects, and it's even harder to control this type of effect in a world in which Uro exists. But even assuming that Uro and Oko didn't exist in a lot of formats, this card is oftentimes going to be very terrible on turn 2 if you can even afford to play it. So now obviously it works a little bit better when people are putting more lands that damage them, like the mythic double faced cards, into their deck. But even in a format like Modern, if my Scourge of the Skyclaves on turn 2 is a 3/3, you know, is that really worth playing? You don't like.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong because I feel like I've read this card 10 times, and it's the highest life total between both players. Correct? It's the
Yes.
same. I have 9 life. My opponent
Yes.
has 17. It's a 3/3.
Correct. You need to
Yeah.
decrease both players' life totals, so it's easy to decrease yours.
Yes, that part we've. It's much easier to decrease your own than your opponent's. That's definitely something that has been just shown to be easier in Death Shadow and things like this. I'm kind of with you. I've read this card and I think it's obviously like, you know, it has a lot of similarities to kind of cards that we've seen in modern, like Death Shadow, and these cards that potentially, oh, is this card gonna be like the next? Like, do you play this in Death Shadow? I mean, I'll ask you, Dylan. Do you think the Death Shadow would get played in this standard format if it was legal in standard? I mean,
No. Well, but
exactly,
you
and
know, it's different, right? Standard doesn't have good enablers,
exactly. But
right?
this is in the context of this. I'm more
Well,
talking in context of standard
yeah,
right
I mean
now, in terms of
that's
like, is
fair.
this card good enough for even standard?
I I mean
Right now.
I think this card, if we had better mana, is playable in standard. Mostly because you probably want to pair it with a one drop. You know, you want to pair it with a one drop, and then you want to play 4 copies of Agadeem's Awakening and 4 copies of, say, Shatter Skull Smashing. You want to pay 3 life on turn 2, and you want to play this, and it's probably a 2/2 that becomes a 4/4 on the following turn. So, but you kind of need a really really good. You need multiple really really good one drops to pair with this, I think, to make it playable in standard. But in standard, it is easier to use the kicker at least, so
It
which
is easier to use the
is
kicker.
relevant. So, but I do think a card like this is paradoxically, when compared to Death Shadow, far more playable in standard than it is in Eternal formats that have better enablers.
Yes.
So
I think the each player side definitely is kind of a sour taste. I mean, it's clearly a homage to, like, they didn't want to make a 2 mana Death Shadow,
right,
which,
right,
I don't really blame them. Like, we have enough Death Shadows in the form of Death Shadow.
right.
We don't want the same card. It's definitely, I definitely don't think this card's bad. But I think within standard it will find some home, but it's sort of, for me, it kind of hits in that Spawn of Mayhem area where it's clearly strong, but is it strong enough in of itself,
Yes,
like, in a vacuum? We've seen Spawn of Mayhem see some success, like, at some points in the meta, and that's kind of where I feel like this card
right.
will hit.
But it's
Where if
also
it
the first
finds a
card that gets
good,
cut.
yeah, if it finds a good deck in an archetype that really, like, wants these kind of, like, effects and is fast enough, then definitely I could see this card seeing play. But this card isn't gonna make a standard Death Shadow style deck or something along those lines. You know,
Yeah, I mean
you're not gonna have a whole deck that revolves around this effect. It's gonna be, the effect is gonna be good because of the deck that you're playing is pressuring them.
yeah, I mean I agree with you. I think one of the important ways to evaluate this card is, you know, a lot of people are expecting it to do bigger things in modern, than I think is really reasonable for a card like this. But in particular, I think the best way to evaluate this card is, would you play a vanilla 2 mana 3/3 in most standard decks? And I think the answer is no.
I
Um,
mean, would you play Zerta Goblin? It's
right,
like,
right. That's why I
you
bring
know,
this up.
you
Right.
know,
The answer is, generally speaking, no. There are some decks that will, right? If they have a bunch of one drops and two drops and they want to kill the opponent quickly, and they just, and maybe it's a card that gets better with Embercleave because, like, it's easier in those decks to reduce your opponent. But at that point, Embercleave plus anything is lethal, so it doesn't really matter. But so. But they do kind of want Embercleave in this card kind of want the same type of decks, where they want decks that play a bunch of cheap creatures, where you can easily manage your opponent's life total, and then you play like Agadeem's Awakening and Shatter Skull Smashing to help manage your own, right? So I
yeah,
think it's
and
totally reasonable, but I think you have to evaluate it as a 2 mana 2/2 or a 2 mana 3/3 for the most part. And I don't think
yeah,
most decks would ever want
and I
that.
mean, quite honestly, when considering the power level of this card, especially in Eternal formats, the kicker, I think, is pretty.
Irrelevant, yes.
It's pretty much never going to happen.
Correct, correct. So
It's
you always have to
you know,
evaluate the card without that text,
and
yes.
like, do I think that this card is, you're swapping out your Tarmogoyfs for this card? No. Um, is there some potential that you play this alongside Tarmogoyf in some shell? I definitely think that there's some modern decks that might want this card,
I mean, maybe Jun Shadow.
and yeah, and there's
I mean,
nothing
they already
wrong.
play, like, some of the Shadow lists already play Gurmag, right? So
Exactly, and there's
this,
nothing wrong
you know,
with those types of cards. I mean, Tarmogoyf is, overall, I think it's very good for the format. I think it's a very good card too, but I don't think it's like a Uro style card. I think it's
no,
just a
not at
very
all.
solid 2 drop that's very it's good for the format. And if that's kind of like where this card is going to be, then I welcome it. If this is the kind of 2 mana card that people are playing, if on 2 mana my opponent plays this card against me, uh, I'm probably going to be a lot happier than some of the other things that we've seen
Yeah.
recently in Modern.
So one last thing I wanted to touch upon this card. So closing thoughts. I'm not really expecting much out of this card in really many formats in general, but there is one nifty little combo you can do with it. So how its power and toughness can be negative, right? So because it's 20 minus. So one thing that was confirmed online is if you use it with Nethroi from Ikoria, you can actually get a combination of creatures that's much greater than the 10 power that Nethroi limits you to. So if you have this in
Mm.
right, so but as long as this is one of
Does it
those
actually
creatures,
count as negative for
yes,
the
for
oh
calculations, yes.
oh
So if you have
that's
yeah, so if the highest life total player is at like 29, right? Then this is a -9, right? So if this is one of the creatures in my graveyard, that counts towards the summation of 10, right? So you can you can target this in your graveyard and then 19 power worth of creatures or whatever with Nethroi. So
so,
there's like some janky potential you can do there with it.
I
So
mean that's interesting.
it's interesting. I don't know what you can really do with that because it also requires a player to be at a really high life total anyway.
Yeah.
In addition to having a stocked graveyard that somehow gives you a combo kill, but maybe there's something that you can do in standard with that because
So
Nethroi is
you're
legal and
saying
whatever.
so
So
your scourges in your sideboard for your Uro mirrors
well,
for what is inevitably every deck that you will see
right,
after
and some
rotation.
sort of combo kill, right? So and then
Exactly.
yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting thing with the card that we might see crop up in standard. I don't know. I mean, Nethroi's not really playable in any other format. So, but there are cards that count like power and stuff. So there may be cards that I haven't really looked at that matter with that. But it's an interesting little interaction. So the next one, I don't really have much to say about this card, is Jace. I'm not super high on it. Granted, I haven't actually tested many games of the standard format. I think the card is solid. I'm oftentimes finding myself trying to find a way to cut it, if that makes sense. Um, but I do think it's pretty cool. But I'm
Yeah,
not
I
expecting a
mean,
ton out of it.
I think this card is pretty good. I think it's definitely think it's good enough for standard in some capacity. I think some deck will want this type of card.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I think it's like Royal Scions or Teferi Master of Time good, where you don't put it in every deck, but there's enough that want like some copies.
yes, is this card better than Teferi Time Raveler? No way.
Right.
That's very clearly not the intention, though.
Is
Is
it better than Royal Scions? I think so.
I think it is better than Royal Scions, and Royal Scions has it's been
It's seen play.
modern Death Shadow. It's seen
Yes.
play, and I'm completely fine if that's the level of, especially for a 3 mana
Yes.
planeswalker.
That's the
That is
level I
just
think this is at.
that's what this should be,
I
and
agree.
I personally I shouldn't even be talking about this card because I'm so biased towards it because I love it so much. I I want it to be really good, and I do think all of the effects, like just the text on this card, do pretty good things, and the kicker is interesting, and just the fact that you can play it on 3, you can play it on 5.
I mean,
The scrying
Scrying
is
2
so
is
good.
really powerful.
The
You know.
the fact that you can potentially do scry 2 into scry 2, you
Yep.
could scry 2 into a draw for
Yep.
free, and things like that. I think it's a very interesting card. It's it sort of fits in the same vein as the modal cards, and the fact that it's almost
Well, that's the
like an
beauty
X
of
card in of
kicker,
itself.
right?
That you just pay 2 more, you get an extra effect, and that's kind of what obviously with how kicker is going to work. But in this card in particular, when it's attached to a planeswalker, and you get an additional copy of it, it's very I don't know I don't know. This one I could even see sneaking into modern. Honestly, that might be my hot take, but I could see this one.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
I don't disagree with you on that. What I mean by I'm not expecting much is I think it's more like Royal Scion's power level
Yes, I
at first
definitely do
glance.
not think this is an auto include in every deck that plays blue. I
Yep.
don't think it's a Jace the Mind Sculptor. level Jace. I don't think it's very Time Raveler or maybe even a Narset. I don't know if this card. I don't. I think this card is not better than Narset, but Narset is very format dependent.
It's true.
It's and that's kind of it's going to ebb and flow as we go through formats. I really like the design space of this card.
I
I'm really
I I
glad that it
love the card. Oh my god. I
I
I love
as a
mechanics like
as
this.
opposed to the planeswalkers that we've seen. Um, this is a breath of fresh air from Oko. And this is coming from somebody that actually likes to play Oko and likes playing against Oko, as
What a
crazy as that might
monster.
sound. I know. Um, this is I like this card. It's a very it's a simple card on its face value, but it's got a lot of complexity to it. It's not as cut and dry as it might look, and I think it might do some surprising things. That's my hot take.
Well, there there
I definitely think
is
this card's good.
one little cool thing you can do with it is Teferi's Ageless Insight. If you played this into Teferi's Ageless Insight, it's 0 mana, draw 2 cards, because Teferi Ageless Insight replaces the draw and reveal with draw 2. So that's a little cute thing you could do in standard. So, but
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know. I like the card a lot. I really like exploring 3 mana planeswalkers that do interesting things. But I will say I'm not expecting this card to define formats, but I do think it'll be a solid role player.
I mean,
Drawing cards in Shrine 2 is really powerful.
I think that this might honestly be I don't even know if I want to say, but sort of similar to Liliana the Veil in terms of like how good I think this card might be in some decks.
I can see
In
that.
terms of like actually,
I mean,
it's
do you
very it's a
do you mean Liliana now or Liliana when she was printed?
I think
Because I would agree
it's
with
hard.
Liliana now, where there's more 3 mana planeswalkers now, where
Yeah, I would say
you
more
know,
now in terms of the kind of the decks that she's being played in and the impact of the card when it's played. It's one of those things where it's like
but you
if you
have to
get
kill it, right?
yeah, you have to kill it, but the modal it feels like it just fits so good because it's just blue. The fact that it can be 3 or 5, I really like that. And I think that scry and draw, it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Mm-hmm.
an egregious card, but I don't think Liliana of the Veil is an egregious card. I think it's you know, if there's decks that take advantage of it better than others, of course there will be. But in a vacuum, it's really all I can rate the card on at the moment. But I definitely think that there's a lot of potential for this card. I don't know if we're talking about I don't know if we're talking about the Nahiri card
Oh,
in this book.
it did not make the list for me,
Okay,
but uh,
clearly I think this card is. I guess I can say it now because I don't know if we're talking about the Nissa either, but I think this is the best planeswalker out of the three by far. Um, in the context of Magic as a whole, I should say. In Standard, I think you can maybe make an argument for the Nissa, but
yeah, I think in
um,
standard, I think I would at first glance, without playing any games, I think I would favor Nissa.
yeah,
But
I
but
think you could definitely make that argument.
in general, I don't think Nissa has that much longevity outside of standard, for example. But I
Yes,
think this Jace does.
and
Um,
I definitely think it's just a card that's even worth considering, which is where I would prefer the 3 mana planeswalkers to be
oh,
nowadays.
absolutely. I don't want them to
So
be
I'm
auto includes in
by
anything, but I want them to be something I
yes.
consider all the time. So I'm gonna move on to the next mythic that we have, which is Tazri, Beacon of Unity. This card makes the list because I have a lot of shells that I'm experimenting with, and I think pretty highly of this card. In general, what we've seen with Party is it doesn't have any singular good, great payoff or anything like that. Um, but there are ways to make really undercosted beaters. So a 4/6, in order to play a 4/6, I don't really ever want to be paying more than 2 or 3 mana for it.
So
Right.
before we even get into Tazri, just very blankly, since it's just the newest mechanic from Zendikar,
Right.
what are your initial impressions of Party?
I like it a lot. I think it's actually pretty good.
Okay,
But
I
I
am
don't think you're going to see very many dedicated party decks, right? But I think the mechanic itself has some pretty powerful cards in it, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
it's it's clearly one of those mechanics. I think it's going to be um, a little too much for to actually see play. Could it there possibly? I don't know. I just with the mechanic in general, I don't know if there's enough of a good payoff. But again, it's one of those things where I don't know if there's just some broken combination of warrior, rogues, clerics, and wizards
So
that work together.
the
That just make it an
I've
auto.
I've poured maybe like 50 hours the last week into examining everything that you can do in Pioneer and Standard with it, and there is no singular great payoff for party. There just isn't. It's the best thing you can do is put it in a Winota deck and kind of make it so you have 8 copies of Winota by playing the tutor, and that's actually a really good payoff.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean,
you know,
Winota's a good card.
like put it like triggering Winota on, and so the tutor is kind of the closest to like the best payoff I think that we have. Though, again, as I kind of mentioned before, I think most of the party cards are playable when you only have like 2 or 3 different creature types. Because a lot of them are reasonable on their own that can become good. And there's actually a lot of really good creatures of each creature type, particularly in Pioneer. In Standard, there's less so, because most of them come from this set. So I'm not expecting it to really see. It's I. So I don't know that I really want to say that. So I think there's better creatures in those creature types in Pioneer that you can justify potentially making a deck of that just relies on those cards being good on their own.
Yeah,
And I don't
and I
think
don't
you can
know.
do that in Standard as much.
Yeah, and I think I might have just the sour taste in my mouth from all these recent sets at the beginning with these very isolated mechanics, like, Eldraine, where we got adventure, and it was a very clearly there was like an adventure theme, and there was like this adventure, here's the payoff, here's what you do, this
Yes.
XYZ. In even, in Eldraine, we had food. Here's your Gilded Goose, here's your wolf, here's your Oko, there's your package, do it. With
Right.
this, it's obviously there's so much room to explore.
Correct.
There's so much more to it. I don't have the time for it. I
Yeah.
leave that up to the people that are actually smart and good at the game, because somebody I'm sure will find a way to fit these party cards into some deck. Will there be this standard obvious party deck?
No.
I don't think that there's enough for that.
But
No.
I
And
I've drawn up like 20 different lists in Pioneer, for example, that are all like some variant of party decks. I have like some bigger brain ones that are like I found a way to like make it so you can play the 4-color humans deck, but like they're all party creatures now, and like a
that was actually
like
one of the things I was thinking of. Is there a
yeah,
way for human decks to just take on a party
it's
shell for free,
it's
essentially?
not free is kind of what I learned.
Yeah.
It's definitely
That
not
was kind of where
free.
my brain
Um,
first went when I heard about the mechanic
yeah.
in terms of eternal formats. Because obviously, all of these are conventional human, types.
Yes.
So that was kind of where my brain
Yeah,
first
it's
went.
just most of the humans that you want to play don't have these. Well, warrior, it's very easy to get warriors for free. Is kind of what I learned. But the rogues and cleric is free too because of this set. But I will say, with exploring and pioneer, a lot of these decks felt like on a pretty similar power level as a lot of other decks that crop up in Pioneer. So I think there's a lot of potential in Pioneer. For example, Veteran Loxodon is a cleric, or Venerated Loxodon.
Yes.
It's a cleric.
Yep.
So and what kind of the rule of thumb I was using was I didn't really want more than 8 of a creature type, and I didn't want less than 6. So 4 Archpriest and 4 Venerated Loxodon is kind of all the clerics you need, right? So there are a lot of turns where you can play a white-based party deck where you play Loxodon plus Tazri on like turn 3 or turn 4. And like that's pretty reasonable. Now turn 4 is a little bit slower, but you can do that turn 3 totally fine. And that's
Yeah.
like pretty solid. So,
And the
um
tricky thing too with the party kind of stuff too is you have to you have the trade off of you need your party, but you also need your payoffs. So there's the
right. So
and
that's what
you
I
need to
wanted to bring
balance your
up.
payoffs with cards that hopefully aren't reliant on party or your party payoffs to be good. They're somewhat good at least in
Yes.
a
So
vacuum.
so that was kind of what I mentioned before, where I think where you'll see party decks is you'll see party decks where all the creatures in the deck are kind of just solid cards on their own. And I think that's the important metric. You don't want to put bad cards just because they have a relevant creature type in your party deck, like you do with most synergy decks. You don't want to do that with party, which is a different way of deck building than I think most people are used to. Because again, there's no except maybe the coveted prize Winota shells, because
Yeah.
you get 8 Winota if you do that. You can put garbage into your deck. But generally speaking, yes, you need your party cards to be relevant, and there is a tension between your payoffs because most of your payoffs are not creature payoffs. They're spells, right? They're
Hmm.
non-creatures.
Yeah.
And you can't put too many of them in your deck. Now, that's why I'm a big fan of Tazri so much in these decks, because most of the time it allows you to focus on things other than warriors, because warriors are kind of free to include in these decks. So now you can have Tazri as a warrior count for your payoffs. And
Yes.
what you want to focus on doing is getting Tazri to costing 2 mana. If I'm playing a 2 mana 4/6 on turn 4, that's fantastic, right? Like that's very good
Yeah.
in
I mean,
Pioneer and Standard. And that's where I think you need to evaluate a card like Tazri in particular, is these party decks in general should be more they should be more like mid-rangey decks, right? Than anything else, because you're trying to eke value out of, big board, big turn 4s, big turn 5s where maybe you play Tazri plus you hold up the counter spell, right? So you want cards that are kind of solid when you only have 2 or 3 different creature types, I think.
yeah.
And I think there's a lot of potential in Pioneer for that. I'm not as sold in Standard, mostly because the mana's not as good. In
Yes.
Pioneer, the mana is very good for these 3 to 4 color creature decks. It's very doable. So
Yeah.
I,
And the
I,
only
I
thing
think
that
there's
that
potential.
the only thing that really holds me back from these sort of party decks is they just seem too fair. They seem too fair to me. The payoffs are they're good, but they're
Well,
not like,
it,
you know,
but there's plenty of really good decks in Pioneer that are just too fair, right?
I mean,
Like
are there?
what does
Like,
Mono Black do that is even remotely unfair?
yeah, but
Nothing,
that has
right?
the aggressive angle.
Well,
I
but
mean,
but
I
all
don't
the
know. I don't
a
know if
lot of the
that's fair
party
to say.
creatures are aggressive too, right? Like the
Yeah,
Archpriest of
but if you're
Iona is a
sort
three
of going into
power.
that
Like,
mid-range
well,
area,
what I mean
you
by
kind
mid
of,
range is not like Mono Black is technically a mid range deck, right? It doesn't kill you on turn 3, turn 4, right?
yeah.
Generally speaking, it kills you turn 5, turn 6, turn 7. It kind of makes it so it can play a slower game if you need. That's kind of what I mean by mid range. Is these decks kind of kill you? They try to kill you on turn 5, but they have some amount of disruption to get them along the way, and that they can play a little bit of a defense game. But like the base of party shells are going to be Archpriest of Iona anyway. So you actually have like aggressive draws that you can get, which is obviously really important for creature decks. You need to have an aggressive draw in
Yeah.
some capacity. So, and I think Tazri helps with that as well, because if you can kind of cheat in 5 power or 4 power creatures, like multiple of them on turn 4, that's a pretty broken thing to be doing, generally speaking. So that's kind of what I mean by mid range. Is not really mid range in the way that Jund is mid range, but mid
I see what
range
you
in
mean.
the way that Rakdos Pyromancer is mid range.
Yeah.
That you have these nutty draws, but you can play a slower game if you need to, I think. And that's kind of what I mean by mid range with this sense, is that you have good standalone party cards, but you can also just randomly nut draw your opponent. Play Archpriest on turn 1, play like Glintsleeve Siphoner on turn 2, like do some like nonsense on turn 3 with like Tazri plus another guy, or just like play Tazri as a 4/6. Now your opponent's dead on turn 4, right? So, and that's a reasonable curve when you think about Tazri actually. Is if you go 1 drop, 2 drop, you can just play him on turn 3 and then kill your opponent on turn 4, right?
Yes.
So there are draws that can kill the opponent quickly in party decks, but I think in standard it's a lot harder because of the mana more than anything else. So that's why I think Tazri in particular has potential, because there's a big difference between Tazri being able to cost 1 and 2 mana as opposed to 2 and 3 mana, like the one green card, the 5/5 Vigilance
Yeah.
that they spoiled. That card can only ever cost 2 minimum, which is much different than a 1 mana 4/6 is astronomically different than a 2 mana 5/5, right? So I like Tazri a lot because it also gives you the ability to somewhat grind out games, because you can activate the ability in these decks to like dig a little bit. So
See, Dylan, the thing is that you're not considering the most important point. The most egregious drawback on this card is the white pip in the corner.
but it's a
That's
creature
the
deck. The white
that's
pip is it's fine. It's a five. It's
that
fine.
that's the that's the biggest drawback.
It's a white card. I mean,
It's a white card.
it's a better white card than most in either of these
Yeah,
formats. But
but it is a 5-color commander, so
that's right. That's right.
that is the woo. They knocked it out of the park on that one.
All right.
Got you on that.
So the next one I want to go over is one that I could talk for hours on, and it's one of the few cards in here that I've actually played a good amount of games with, or decent amount of games with, maybe like 10 or 20 matches. Playtesting is Seagate Stormcaller. This card was getting a ton of hype when it was first spoiled, obviously. But there's somewhat of controversy around it because it's kind of it's somewhat similar to Snapcaster Mage, but you have to have the spell in hand. Obviously, it only works for that turn. It doesn't really work on like counter spells, right? So it's more of a proactive card. If anything, it's more similar, I think, to Dreadhorde Arcanist in card philosophy than it is to Snapcaster Mage. But it is getting a lot of talk about it. I think quite highly of this card. I think it's good. I think it's close enough to a I think it's better than Jace Vryn's Prodigy in many different decks in across formats, but it's not without drawbacks. Obviously, like not being able to target your counter spells means that you may have to approach deck building a little bit differently. In Standard and in Pioneer in particular, maybe you value something like Drown in the Lock a lot more because when you don't have this card, you can counter a spell, but when you do have this card, you can double up on a kill spell, stuff like that. But even turn 3, playing this and doubling up on a Thoughtseize is really, really good. So, I think this card has a lot of potential, and I think part of that potential is realized because of cards like Unearth or Claim to Fame, where you could potentially, just chain a ton of value off of a card like this.
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty interesting effect. It's definitely not a Snapcaster Mage just instantly, obviously slam dunk, because I did see a lot of people that were kind of a little disappointed in this card when it was first revealed. The
Oh,
fact that it
absolutely.
wasn't Snapcaster,
Yeah.
it's like obvious. Hopefully, they wouldn't print just a blatant copy of the card, but like, I think that this card is like you can't deny this effect is good.
Right.
I think that that's no one is saying that this effect is bad. It's just, is it good enough to, be putting into your deck? Sort of like, does it need to be a build around? Does it need to be? Because I think you can make the argument for Dreadhorde Arcanist is you kind of got to build your deck in a certain way for it to really
Absolutely.
be effective. Is
Yes.
that kind of where this card is
I,
in terms? And
I would
it's
say
it's
no.
yeah, it's a more generically good card
Yeah. Well,
than
most instant and sorcery
Dreadhorde.
spells that we put into competitive decks outside of Standard are 1 and 2 mana anyway. The vast majority of instant and sorcery spells you're going to want to copy are 2 or less regardless, right? Which is different than Dreadhorde Arcanist, which requires basically exclusively 1 mana spells, right? There's a big difference between opening that up to 1 mana spells and 2 mana spells, I think. For example, if you look at a deck like Death Shadow in Modern, for example, almost all of that deck's instants and sorceries cost 2 or less, and it plays a lot of them.
Yep.
Even doubling up on a cantrip on turn 3 is totally respectable for a card like this, because it's flexible in that regard. It's not always a cantrip. Sometimes it's an extra Thoughtseize, so, and things of that nature. So, and it's kind of like at the very least it refunds your 1 mana spell. If I play this and Serum Visions, I spent 4 mana to get I effectively spent 4 mana. Right now, granted,
Yeah.
I'm overpaying for a 2/1, but that's fine. But the fact that it has interactions with Kolaghan's Command, because you can return it to hand to reset another spell in the future, but also has interactions with like Unearth, which is like pretty sick when you think about it. You can unearth a copy of this and then cast like another card from graveyard, or like maybe copy another unearth, and suddenly you get back all of your. Now you get back a Snapcaster Mage, and stuff like that. So, and even in Standard, you've got there's like even in like a blue red deck, like it's a wizard, which is super relevant, but you could also like copying a shock is great in Standard on turn 3. Play a
Yeah.
2/1 and deal 4 damage to your, like, that's insane, right? So Even Opt is great. So I think
Yeah.
the fact that most instance and sorcery spells are only playable if they cost 3 or less, and most of them are 2 or less, I think makes a card like this much better than a lot of people would necessarily think. But yeah, it's definitely so. I don't think you have to build your deck in the way that you would with Dreadhorde Arcanist, but you definitely do have to realize that you can't. It's not free to put into decks in the way Snapcaster Mage is. So
Yes.
it's somewhere in between, I think.
And I really do think that this card, like you mentioned, most of the cards that you're going to be copying with this, especially like 1 and 2 mana cards, are just going to be really good cards that you're playing anyway, especially in modern and even Pioneer.
Yeah,
You're just playing good cards, and copying good cards is
copy a
always good.
lightning bolt.
And it's it's an interesting one. The only thing that I kind of like for modern especially is like I don't know what cards you're cutting for this. That's my only thing
Correct.
is it's hard to envision that just off the top of my head. Is there decks where they will make the cut for this card? I could see that.
I
It's
mean,
just off the top of my head. I
yeah.
can't think of anything
I mean,
obviously,
I think a lot of your so I mean there's not many anymore, but I think any sort of obviously I may be biased seeing as I'm one of the renowned blue red blood moon players out there, but I would snap 3 of this off in that deck. Um, and it's better than Thing in the Ice in a deck like that. Mostly because they've given so many answers to bigger creatures now for the blue decks, but mostly because those decks kind of just want to copy Lightning Bolt a bunch of times. So um, in terms of modern, it is interesting into what you would cut. For example, in Death Shadow, how many uh, a lot of those decks don't even play for Snapcaster Mage, right? So,
yeah.
how can I think this card is better than Snapcaster Mage in a lot of the Death Shadow decks. Well, not necessarily better in the decks, but better in a lot of board states than Snapcaster Mage because it's better on turn 3, like because you can double up on your Fatal Push that turn, and you can't do
I
that
think this
with
card
Fatal
is
Push.
actually
So,
super good in Esper Death
oh,
Shadow. And that
absolutely,
makes me super happy
absolutely. I think it's
because I love
better.
Esper Death Shadow.
Yeah. So I think it's actually better than Snapcaster in some of those more aggressive decks where oftentimes Snapcaster actually just costs too much mana when you think about it. Snapcaster is a 4 mana thing to get 2 uses out of a spell. This is a 3 mana thing to get 2 uses out of a spell. If that makes
Yeah, and
sense,
it's
So
you know that's really I think there's decks right now that play Snapcaster that are essentially doing the same thing as this card anyway.
correct.
And that those decks obviously will just play this
Yes.
because they're not even
I mean,
taking advantage of. And it's nice to have those options.
maybe the fact that you have this and Snapcaster means you might see a deck where you actually just play a bunch of both. Because you have enough consistency of those
It's true.
effects. That you could, like maybe you actually see burn decks playing Snapcaster again. That was something we saw a long, long time ago. Maybe you just play more 1 mana red spells and you just play this. Now, we kind of already have decks that do that with Lava Dart and Gutshot anyway, the prowess decks, but like,
Yeah.
so maybe there's like some other types of decks that crop up and just decide that they want both of those effects. I don't know. Also, Mystic Sanctuary can kind of set this up, which is kind of cool. Um, so,
Yeah. It's
I don't know.
clearly the effect is powerful. It's gonna see play.
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely not one that, and that's what I really like about it in terms of like all of these cards that, especially all these mythics, is that they look like they have some impact on eternal formats, but it's not like, oh yeah, this card is gonna dominate or this card is gonna create a new archetype. These are just good cards that fit into things. And will there be new decks? I mean,
Oh,
there
absolutely.
probably
Yeah.
will be because that's just how it
I mean,
is. The
I can
constant
already
changing metagame and
envision.
things.
Yeah.
But it's not as like at least until we get Modern Horizon 2, which is obviously coming later. But these are not companion decks. Companion cards are going to change everything. It's not going to be these aren't Oko style cards where you need to completely change your deck to you just cut all your removal because you have Oko. These are just really solid cards that they might have chance. It's just nice to go back to that. They might have a chance to play, might not. It's nice to just be back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's a lot of cards on here that that like obviously I think a lot of the potential of making a new archetype is obviously different than the way that Companion or Oko or Uro did it, where you have one singular card that's so good that it makes a new archetype. I think for a lot of these cards are very, very good cards. But for some of them, it's kind of now decks have 7 or 8 cards of this type of effect that they can run, and that maybe spawns a new archetype. And
Yeah.
so I do think there's a lot of new archetype potential for the set, probably more so than a lot of other sets, but it's less focused on individual cards and more focused on what cards are better because of these cards, which I think is a really interesting spot to be. I'm happy with it. I'm actually gonna skip the next two mythics because it's Morag and Ashaya. Just because we went on a little long about the most recent cards, but and I'm not like super interested in those cards in particular. If that makes sense. Morag is mostly just like, well, you can combo it with like sneak attack and like random stuff like that. So
Yeah.
it's like you cheat into play and you play a fetch land, and that's like the only real interesting part about it. And Ashaya is a card that is just really weird and quirky, and I'm not sure what all my thoughts are on Ashaya yet. If I'm being honest, but we also just have a lot more cards in list, so I just want to kind of move on a little
Yeah, let's
quicker.
run through it.
Yeah.
So,
So Null Priest of Oblivion is the next one. I'm actually very, very high on this card. I think this card. Well, I should give that. So I'm very high on this card in Standard, and I think it's pretty solid in Pioneer. I'm not as convinced in Modern because 6 mana is a huge ask in a format like Modern, but in Pioneer, it's a lot easier to justify, and in Standard, I think this card is fantastic. It's also has Cleric is the weakest creature type for the party decks because your one drop is your best one drop is a cleric. So cleric itself has weaker value on curve for 2 drops for party decks. But I think the card itself is fantastic. Typically, cards like this tend to be pretty good in standard. And I don't know. I love cards like this. I think it's very easy to replace Gifted Etherborn with this in like every Pioneer deck that plays Gifted Etherborn, and I think that most of the Lurrus decks should play a couple copies of this card because barring maybe Ors of Aras or any of the black like Rakdos Pyromancer in Pioneer, I think should play 2 copies of this card because that deck can tend to flood out, and it gives you the ability to. You can also just like cast it in like chain, like get back a Lurrus, like cast something else. So there's a lot of value you could do with a card like this, but obviously it works in slower formats. 6 mana for a 2/1 is too much, so you need it's a matter.
yeah, it's definitely an ask, but again, the ceiling on the card, it can exceed your wildest dreams with this. It's an extremely powerful kicker effect. Um, but even a 2/1 menace
It's
with
totally
lifelink or
fine.
two
Yep,
is,
very
it's
respectable.
it is. It's the
It's also
lifelink
yeah,
is fine. Menace is obviously amazing.
yep.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have too much to say about it just because it's um
I mean, I really don't. I just think it's a solid card.
yeah,
I think it's really good in standard because it's an above average 2 drop, and when you flood out, it's a fantastic card. So I
yeah,
think that's really all there is to say about it. Like there's
yeah, it's really fits that mold. It's a very good 2 drop that if you kick it, then you are feeling pretty good. You don't feel bad about drawing this late,
yes, and I will say,
which is,
um, this is unique for Lurrus decks in other formats. They don't typically get access to creatures that return things to play. So Lurrus decks, in Pioneer, for example, you can play this kind of for free in some of your because a lot of decks will play like a Gifted Etherborn in the Lurrus decks, right, to mitigate some of the aggressive decks. And
mhm.
yes, one toughness is a liability against Chain Whirler decks, but a 2/3 oftentimes doesn't do anything if they have a Chain Whirler anyway, so it's kind of the same. But oftentimes the Lurrus decks have to rely on instants and sorceries to bring back their cards. They don't have an engine built into 2 drops. This itself is an engine with Lurrus because you can just ensure that your Lurrus never dies if you play a couple copies of this. So that is, something that I think is worth noting in other formats as well. Is this is the first one of the first times that we see a 2 mana creature be able to return things to the battlefield, which we typically don't get to see. So yes, it costs 6 mana to do that, but the fact that it's 2 mana is actually a very relevant thing, I think. So
Yeah, I think that it's a 2/1 with Menace is the lifelink. Obviously, the if it had Menace and if it had only Menace, I would probably rate it the same.
as if it
I
had
don't think
lifelink,
there's too.
absolutely, yeah.
If it had Menace and lifelink, I don't think there's too much you know, use for the lifelink, at least in terms of value of the card. But obviously, yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up. It's
Yeah.
really just a unique effect, a 2-drop that can do something very as meaningful as this effect on turn 6. It's it's always something that you want to consider.
Yep. Yep. All right. So the next card is Kazandu Mammoth. This was a card that on Twitter in particular I saw a lot of hype about, but I mostly wanted to put this card on there, not necessarily because I think it's gonna be like totally like bananas in aggressive decks or whatever. Though I do think it is absolutely phenomenal in aggressive decks, particularly in standard, somewhat in Pioneer a little bit because you can play Fabled Passage on turn 4, and then Ember Cleave onto it and just kill your opponent and you can do that pretty reasonably in Pioneer Gruul, for example. But generally speaking, I love the design of a card that wants you to play more lands while it itself could also be a land. So, like, multiple copies kind of fuel itself. And then it gives you an interesting point on turn 4. Do I play this tap land to give this +2/+2, or do I just play another 3/3 in case I draw another thing on the future turn? So, I love the design of this card. I think it's just pushed enough, and it's not overloaded with, like, keywords that it's clearly not designed for modern play, but
Yeah.
it is reasonable enough, I think, to see play in Pioneer. And I would be surprised if this wasn't a 4 of in Standard.
Yeah, I can definitely see it. I think it really the fact that it can be a land, we didn't talk too much about the kind of just the generic these kind of spells that come with the tap lands.
Yes.
But in general I like them too. Just to I don't want to talk too much on it on the in general, but I do like the effect. I like that it sort of has synergy with that landfall and of itself. It can kind of fuel itself the more copies you play and things like that. And I mean, a 3/3 for 3 that, when you play land, it does have Fable Passage. This is a fine card. Like you
Yes.
said, it's not egregious, but it's clearly, you know, intended to be good, if that's a good way to put it.
Oh yeah.
And so,
I think it's a card like this is supposed to see Standard play, if
yeah,
that makes
this is the
sense,
kind
right?
of card that they print and they're like, oh, we got to sell some green rares, let's make it good. But it's not like a tireless tracker style card where you're gonna see it everywhere. But this is fine, and
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with that. And
I mean, it lives in a standard format with Fabled Passage. How bad can it be, right?
yeah, and it's a green card that doesn't draw cards, so
I'm happy it
I'm
exists.
happy that that's kind of where green's going again. But
Yep.
this is a very it's good. It's good. It's where green should be. Move
Yep.
green away from the Hydroid Crisis and stuff,
Yes.
and
Yes,
go
please.
more towards where this is, and this is fine.
I,
So
I think card draw like Tireless Tracker is great for green. I don't think card draw like Hydroid Crisis is great for green. But anyway, I think that sums it up well. It's a card that's supposed to see play, you know, and it being a land is sometimes being a land. It for a card like this, you almost never want to play it as the land, but having that option is nice. It's also a card that you feel more comfortable skimping on lands with because you in aggressive decks you want spells, right? And
yes,
a card like this, it's okay to play a tap land on turn 4 and not play your questing beast, right?
yeah,
So it mitigates some of the drawback of this mechanic, right? Of the ones that always come into play tapped. So, and a card like this is totally fine, in that regard. So, I like it a lot. Am I expecting it to be like it's in no way will it ever be Uro dominant in standard, but it should see play, I think.
yeah, and
So,
we'll see where standard goes in the future. Who
oh
knows what
yeah,
will happen to Uro? So
hopefully it's better. But the next card I want to talk about is actually I think the singular best party payoff that they've given us, and it actually could be a real legitimate reason to play a party deck in a way that we hadn't seen before, particularly in Pioneer, where, well, if you play the four color humans deck with party, you lose out on Thalia's Lieutenant and General Kudrow. So what are you getting in return, right? Other than some cheap undercosted beaters. And this one is Nimble Trap Finder. It's the blue rare rogue. So the reason I think this card is the best payoff is because giving all of your creatures Curious Obsession is absolutely bananas. And so when you hit the full party and all of your creatures get that, generally speaking, that means you can kind of load your deck up with creatures that are good at attacking, right?
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong.
So
That's the one that as long as you have a another party member, essentially it can't be blocked, and then if you have the full party, then you draw a card, discard a card.
No, no. So it can't be blocked if you had another party member enter this turn. So that part
Oh,
was
okay, yeah, yeah.
correct. And at the beginning of combat, if you have a full party, all of your creatures gain when this creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card.
Okay, yeah,
So
yeah.
there's no the discard one is there's something else that has that. There is
Yeah,
another one
I
that has
remember.
it,
I
but
think I saw this card maybe yesterday,
yeah,
so I'm
yeah,
trying to
it's
remember it.
one
I
of
know
the
this one
newer
was kind of
ones.
recently.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this one
so
was
but
newer, and
yeah, it's really
I think it's insane. I think if you're playing party, I think this is the reason to play party. This is also in the same color as the counterspell in party, the Stubborn Denial card. And
yep.
so and to your point of is there a big party payoff? Not really. But I think this and the tutor I think are the closest, to I really want to play party. Now there are actually pretty reasonable payoffs on curve. The next card we're going to talk about as well. But in terms of Nimble Trap Finder, I think it has a lot of potential in Pioneer because a lot of the creatures you can put in your deck that are party creatures are really good at attacking. And you could play something like Coco if you wanted to, but something like Reflector Mage, for example, is a wizard. You know, so you can
Yeah.
play this, play Reflector Mage. My guy's unblockable. Bounce your guy, attack with my 1 and my 2 drop, and then your opponent has to play stuff, and then you're like, okay, I have full party, bounce your guy, attack, right? Like Brazen Borrower is a rogue, but like generally speaking, like there are a lot of humans that are good at attacking that have party things. So this is probably, I think, the best party payoff because even if you only draw one card a turn with it off of this guy, that's still great for a 2 drop, right? like,
Yeah, I mean,
you know, so and you only draw the card when you have the full party. To be fair, but it is actually pretty reasonable to get full party in Pioneer, for example. It's easier than in Standard. So it is actually pretty reasonable to turn on full party on turn 4, and a card like this actually makes it easier for you to justify taking a slower game, So which I think is pretty crucial. So anyway, this is the one where I think it's the potentially the best party payoff. It's one of the reasons I think to skew some of your blue aggressive decks that aren't spirits to be party because you get this and then you also potentially get Linvala or the counterspell or whatever. So there are tools that are and this card is like reasonable on its own, but it's probably the closest we have to a great party payoff, I think. Because
yeah.
drawing like 2 cards a turn off of your attacks is insane. Like we've seen how many decks can't keep up with spirits when they draw like blue-eyed spirits when they draw like an extra card a turn, right? And they actually
Yes.
don't play very many counter spells. They only play like 6 or 7, right?
Yeah.
So and it's still very difficult for even Uro decks at times to keep up with the fact that my aggressive deck is drawing more cards than me. So I do think a card like this has potential to make an entire archetype on its own. Um, so
Yeah, I think it's really just going to come down to, how party's gonna be affected. I think this is definitely like if you're playing a party deck, clearly this is one of the first cards that you're gonna want to,
absolutely,
lean towards. It's really just going to come down to how that party deck comes together
yes,
for whether or not this card sees play.
yeah. And I will say in Pioneer, for example, we do have Mutavault, which you can tap it to activate itself to turn on a card like this, for example. So in Pioneer, it is easier than in Standard, as I mentioned before, to turn it on. But yeah, exactly. It kind of depends on the context of the deck, I think. But it is a really powerful payoff. So I would be surprised if someone didn't find a way to make a card like this playable. I know I'm making a ton of lists with it anyway, but yeah, exactly. So I think it's going to depend obviously on what does your deck look like when you don't have this card. So
Yeah.
the next one I want to talk about is also a party card, and I'm just going to briefly mention this one because I'm not expecting too much of it, though it has a pretty high ceiling. Is Squad Commander. That's the one that makes a token for each member of in your party.
Yep.
So, um, on curve, you're probably only making 2 to 3 tokens, but it is a 4 mana 3/3, and it actually has like a pretty reasonable party payoff. The difference, however, is it's not a human, so you can't grab it off of Winota, which is kind of what you would want with a card like this. But you know, in standard, I think this is actually probably better than Nimble Trap Finder in terms of party payoff because it gives all of your creatures +1 power and indestructible till end of turn. So a card like this, you actually just get to attack with your full party every turn with like no consequences. You can just jump
Yeah.
attack. So, in a format like Pioneer, it's a lot harder to justify playing a 4 mana card like this when you could just play Collected Company, right? So, I don't know about it in Pioneer, but in Standard, I think this card is actually quite good. Like how many tokens does your 4 mana 3/3 need to make for it to be standard playable? Two, three, like somewhere between 2 and 3 probably. So you
Yeah.
know,
I mean, it definitely raises that question of like what's the threshold of like where this card is good? Does it just need to make one batch of tokens with, you know, itself and another party member for it to be good? It's
right. Or do
that's
you
really
need
what.
like yeah like the fact that it is a warrior, right? So the fact that it does count itself means that yeah, exactly, you only need one other creature to make 2 tokens, right? So yeah, if making 2 tokens is good, then this card's great, right? uh
Yeah. And I mean
if you
there
so
is also the fact that it does make warriors. So
correct,
that if they
yes,
kill this, you still have a warrior,
exactly,
which I
yes,
do think has some level of, you want as many of these party guys as you can get out just for the
yeah,
sake of, you know,
and
consistency on your party mechanic.
And maybe it's good in like Boros Winota in standard anyway because you have the warrior lord that gives all like warriors like +1/+1 or whatever like that, the red white uncommon, and Winota herself, like can utilize these tokens on turn 5 potentially to like find whatever humans, all of your Basri's lieutenants or whatever. So they're like yeah, I mean, I think I would be surprised if this card didn't see standard play. I think it's a card that should see standard play. The benchmark for me is I'm not sure it'll see Pioneer play. I don't expect it to, if I'm being honest. But whereas I expect some of the party cards to see a little bit of Pioneer play. I don't expect this one to be particularly good. But yeah, exactly. I think in standard, making 2 tokens off of my 4 mana 3/3 is a lot more reasonable. I think. As
I
a
agree.
threshold. So, and I think that's pretty safe. Also, in standard, the giving all your creatures aspect of when you have full party actually should come up a lot because it allows you to chump attack into big dumb green creatures all the time with no consequence. So you can actually just chip in for damage. So that's one of the ways you lose to Uro, right? Is they attack with Uro, and you're like, well, I'm not losing. I'm not like being raced by the 6/6 that gains them 3 life, but they're also playing blockers after it that I then also have to oftentimes jump attack to, or they just hold their Uro back early on in the game and it like brickwalls your whole board because you're going to lose a guy every time you attack into it. And you're like, well, if I attack into Uro and they block and they eat my biggest creature and I hit them for 4 or 5, and then they attack with Uro the next turn, I've dealt no damage and I've lost a guy. So, but a card like this allows you just attack for free. So, yeah, I actually expect good things out of standard for this card.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that we can see. It's like you said, 4 mana. How many tokens do you need to make for it to be good? You know, it's just really gonna it's just gonna come down to how consistently you can keep that party and really use it to the fullest extent of what a party deck is gonna look like.
Yeah, absolutely. With and it may be harder in standard when you don't have cards like Mutavault, when you don't have access to just better mana to be able to play more cards from different colors, maybe it's harder actually to get party in standard than I'm assuming it is. So I haven't played many games with standard party decks at all. So I'm not actually sure in that front. But yeah, I mean, the mana in standard is better for aggressive decks than in a lot of standard formats, but it's by no means great or necessarily
Yeah, I mean,
feasible, right? To
yeah, I
play
mean
four
it's
color
not
decks, right? So
it's not phenomenal. It's
yes,
good and it's better than some formats, but it's definitely not like you get to play 3 color 1 drop aggro for free.
exactly. You definitely don't. So, it may be a challenge to make a card like this work, but at first glance, I'm excited for standard for this card. So we'll see. And this is kind of where party kind of falls, where it's a lot of cards that are solid, but is being solid good enough? And I don't know that anyone can know, right? So
Yeah. Is it just too fair?
right. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So a card like this could potentially be broken with Monota, maybe. If you're consistently making but then at the same time you played this card, you made 3 tokens. Say, you evidently had 3 other creatures in play that probably triggered Winota, right? So maybe you
Exactly.
didn't need that, right? So that's the other thing. But it does kind of turn on Embercleave by itself, which is you know not without merit, but
I mean, Embercleave's very good,
yep,
so
it gets better now that Teferi's gone. So
a lot of things get better, to be fair.
oh yeah. Um, I'm going to. So, really talk about all those? Okay, I'm gonna skip over Glasspool Mimic, just because it's not. I don't think it's particularly interesting. Um, that's the one that copies a
Yeah,
creature.
the
Yeah.
Phantasmal Image
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
1 more mana.
yeah, it can't copy your opponent's stuff. That's why it's I think less interesting. But
Mm-hmm.
um, so then I'll talk about. We'll just talk about Archpriest of Iona because the last 2 cards we talked about were party. So I figure we'll just skip a little bit ahead, talk about the thing that kind of put party in a matter of competitive discussion, which is Archpriest of Iona. It's the 1 drop. Um, Having power equal to the number of creatures in your party on a 1 drop is actually pretty powerful. On curve, this is usually going to be a 2/2 for 1 white mana, which is pretty reasonable.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
this card is good.
this card is good. I mean, even just a 1 mana 1/2 is with a potential upside
Yeah,
is it's hard not to at least think like even if this could be a one like you mentioned a 1 mana 2/2 potentially even a 1 mana 3/2
yeah,
that's definitely pretty attractive, especially in white. Where
yes,
if that's kind of where the deck is going to be going, is towards this sort of you know, white weenie kind of shell. In a sense, where it's really about just dudes and just beating them down as fast as you can. This is the kind of card that you would want to do that.
yeah. I mean, a lot of the party cards are kind of in this vein, right? Where they're reasonable on their front. If you get a collective group of them, you can kind of just kill people real quick. So, but yeah, I mean, I think really highly of this card. I think this is one of the things that makes me kind of want to make party shells work in Pioneer, and it's one of those things that makes me want to try and make them work in Standard. I think it's probably the most appealing part about Party is you just have a great 1 drop. And it's not too hard to find at least a semi-playable 1 drop for a little bit of consistency because you don't really need too many 1 drops. So that's I think the difference between Party and a lot of other aggressive decks is a lot of other aggressive decks want to load up on the same mana cost of I want a bunch of ones and a bunch of twos. Whereas Party,
Yeah,
because it's payoffs, you need different creatures. You don't really want to load up on a lot of multiples of the same type of effect. So you don't playing 12 1 drops in your party deck is only good if you could play both those 1 drops in the same turn, right? So, um, so I think it's super interesting, and the payoff for getting full party is actually very good on this card. So you're just gonna end games pretty quickly with it. So I don't know. The card's a slam dunk good card, right? So
Yep,
not
I
a lot to
agree.
say about
It's
it, but yeah,
if there's a party deck, this will be in it.
absolutely.
Like that is just no question. And we've
Yeah.
seen a lot of these good party cards. They are that same vein of cards that fulfill party, but also
Yes.
they have the upside. Those are the
Yes.
cards that are clearly dependent on a party deck, but it's going to be those cards that really push it to the playability.
Oh yeah, because the party cards that we aren't talking about are the ones that are only good when you actually have a bunch of party stuff, right? I don't
Yeah,
think those ones are really ever be good. The exception is Tawzri because it doesn't really require very many to be a good card, you know.
yeah,
So, and the difference with Archpriest as opposed to these other cards is Archpriest is fantastic if you only ever have one other creature. It's not just good, it's fantastic. A 1 mana 2/2 in white is fantastic.
one mana 2/2s are good.
Yeah, the reason Isamaru isn't like playable in in modern is because a 1 mana 2/2 isn't great in modern, right? The format has moved well
Yes.
beyond that. But in terms of standard and pioneer, 1 mana 2/2s are good, you know.
And this
So
just this isn't just a one mana 2/2. I
right,
mean, this could be potentially
three
a
two
one
or
mana
4/2
4/2
exactly.
buffing your guys and giving
Yes.
flying. You know, like
Yeah, but you
the
know, if you're not a party deck, it's probably not going to be a 4/2, right?
yes,
But if you're not a party deck, even in just a normal white, like, say you're like a white red aggro deck or white black aggro, it's probably a 2/2 almost always, and then grows into a 3/2. And that's fantastic for a 1 drop, you know?
yep,
You can't really get that rate beat. So I think obviously Slam Dunk, if there's a party deck, it plays this card. You know, this is probably the only 1 drop you need to play in a lot of the party decks too. You know, because you can play this, you can play a 2 drop on turn 2, you can play this and a 2 drop on turn 3, and then set up party on turn 4. Like, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of good aspects of this card. So I just wanted to skip ahead and talk about that one because we had already mentioned Squad Commander and Nimble Trap Finder before, so figured it's fresh that we have at least relatively playable cards to compare it to. So the next one's coming up then. Um, I'm gonna skip Skyclave Shade, mostly because I don't think this card is really good enough in any format other than Standard, because it's kind of worse than recursive creatures that we already have access to in older formats. Um, you know, like Scrap Heap Scrounger is a better card than this, right? So, um, but
yeah. I
I
mean, Scrap Heap Scroungers. Even if you're worse than Scrap Heap,
right. I mean,
you still have
that's still a
potential.
very playable benchmark. Yeah, I just don't think there's really that much interesting to say about this card, if that makes sense,
Yeah,
because it kind of just is another like we've seen Bloodgust already. You know, like these types. So it's not really interesting. I obviously it's a card that since it can't block, it only has applications in like aggressive decks. So in standard, you're playing this because you're planning to attack with it, and then if your opponent kills it on 2, you play a land, you cast it again, etc. You know, so I don't think it's particularly interesting as a
yeah.
card.
I mean, it's like Gutter Bones. It's
Right,
kind of like the
right.
same vein of that card
Yeah,
where it's like,
exactly.
is it good? Yeah, but is it like
Do I want to
it's gonna?
talk about it?
Do I want to talk about it? We all know what it does. We kind of know where it fits. We know what it does. It goes deals damage and it comes back. That's kind of what I mean, that's what Mono Black and Pioneer is built upon at this point. It's just
Yep.
these kinds of effects. I don't know if it'll see play
Yeah, I
in
mean,
that deck because Pioneer is kind of doesn't have blood gas, so it's kind of has more room for these type of effects. But
I
it's
think I would play like I think it's better than Spawn of Mayhem in general in that deck, but
yeah, I mean, it's the fact that you even have to think about it. It's enough for me. So
yep, yep.
it's that's really I feel the same way. But there was a lot of hype for this card
Oh,
when it was
absolutely.
announced, and there's
It's a good card.
because there was so many callbacks to it's like, oh, is this going to be the next broken thing? And it's like, it looks similar, but it's got more downsides. Not as good, but there's nothing wrong with being less good than a clearly disgustingly good card.
Oh, absolutely. So when I only want to talk briefly about this is Wayward Guide Beast, which is the red tutu. Um,
Yep.
people
The
are
uh,
dump. Yeah,
the
people are.
Goblin Guide budget,
Yes,
the budget Goblin Guide.
people are trashing on this card. They fucking hate this card.
I've seen a lot of hate for this card.
I
Seen,
think this card is very good.
yeah, I don't know exactly. My gut instinct is it's not good enough, but I do think that it's the downsides of it are not that egregious in the right deck. I don't know if that deck
Right.
that this would fit in is good enough right now. I'm mostly talking about in a standard environment,
That
but
yes.
yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
if that deck exists right now.
That's a good point. So
That's my only downside. I don't clearly 2/2 trample haste is really really good. It's like
right.
for 1 mana, it's just the downside's obviously pretty significant in of itself too. The main thing is that there is going to probably be a deck with this card. I just don't think it's the cards for that deck have been released yet.
Right. So
This
in
card gets way better as we get more sets too.
correct. So
This is the kind of
in
card that just gets exponentially better.
yeah, well you want more like one drops are good. So yeah, I mean like a card like this in standard, I don't think it's quite there. I do think this card is totally there in Pioneer and Modern. Um, and what I mean by that is we already have decks in those formats that fit all the aspects of this card. You know, they're aggressive, they have a ton of one mana spells, and they don't really oftentimes they miss enough land drops that this card is free, right?
Yeah.
So in something like
Good.
Burn, for example, if you play this on turn one, you don't have to attack with it on turn one, and that's what I think a lot of people are forgetting is it's totally fine to play a one mana 2/2 with no haste. That's
Yeah.
totally fine because then you can play your second land, you know, like because then you could still play like 2 mana worth of spells and then return a land because you know you're not going to hit your third land drop. So then you just have 2 mana again and then you just continually have 2 mana for the rest of the game, but that's all you need, right? So,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
mean, there's gonna be some point where in Magic's history they're gonna print enough of these nutso one drop cards that you only need to play one drops in your deck and you only need 1 mana.
so
You know, it's like
it's
at
funny
some
you
point,
it's funny you bring that up because that is actually an archetype in Magic's history. So we've back in Theros Standard Era, we actually the original Theros, we actually had a slide deck that played like 18 mountains, and you played like 31 drop cards. I mean, a lot of them were spells, but still, you just played like 22 one mana red creatures. So we have historically had decks like that have a lot of success.
yeah,
And
I mean,
and a card like this is fantastic in those decks because those decks don't really care about like yeah, if you played on turn 1 and attack, in some games that may lose you the game, but oftentimes those decks keep one landers and then it's kind of it helped you hit your land drop, right?
yeah,
So so I think this card is actually quite good, but exactly as you mentioned, you would have it's perfect in decks like that, right? Where you play a very small amount of lands, a ton of one drops, and then this card is very similar to like Mem Knight in a lot of ways, right? Like, so it's funny you mentioned that because we've actually historically had decks like that, but they were mostly before your time in Magic. It's been a while since we've had a red deck like that, but this is one of the reasons I think to try and be that. Now, exactly as you said, this is a card that gets better the more cards we see printed, right? Because you want
yeah.
a lot of like solid one drops for a card like this to be pretty good. So yeah, I mean, I that's why I think this card is quite good because I think even in Pioneer and Modern, you'll find decks that will play this card.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot something that a lot of people are overlooking is what you mentioned about this could potentially be your land drop for turn. The land
Yes,
that you pick up is your land drop. That's what I think a lot of it's very hard to conceptualize how good that is because clearly you're not drawing lands to play for your land drop, but then you're not drawing lands. You're drawing
exactly,
good cards. And
exactly.
that's good in of itself for some decks. So that's what a lot of decks want to be doing. This card is I mean, it's good. It's a good card. It has a very meaningful drawback, but it should be because
Also,
trample haste for 1 mana on a 2/2 is really good.
Yep. So like the other thing to note is like it's also kind of a trap card. And what I mean by that is it kind of is like, oh, it's a 2/2 trample haste on turn 1. Obviously, I'm going to play that in attack. When I think a card like this, you almost never haste is actually for when you play it on turn 2, generally speaking, or
Yeah,
later in the game.
exactly.
It's not for turn 1, and that's different than how we're used to evaluating haste creatures, I think. Typically, we see them as, oh, you play it on curve, haste is great because you get the effect immediately, but it's really haste is kind of better on this card because of later in the game when you play it on turn 2 or whatever. So yeah, and like the cool thing with this card is like, you know, it can be difficult to return a land to your hand, right? Because obviously if your opponent has a 2/2 that they can block with and you have this and another 2/2 attacking, they have to pick which one to kill, right? So they have to gauge whether or not you have a land in hand anyway, which I think is an interesting dynamic. And then if you don't have a land, you could just potentially spectacle like a light up stage or something, right? So I don't
Yeah.
know. You know, that's why I think this card is good, and I see so many people trashing on it, and I understand where they're coming from, but I don't think they're evaluating it fully. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
and I mean it's definitely not an easy card to evaluate. It's definitely it's very conceptual based on what deck you're playing, what the meta is going to be. It's, there could be some formats where this card just is complete trash, but there's that's kind of how all these cards work. Is
yep.
it's just in a vacuum. Like if the right circumstances come along where this kind of card clearly fits into a certain type of deck and that deck is good, then this card will be very good in that deck.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of the issues I have with how people evaluate cards is a lot of people don't evaluate cards within context. They always look at a card either comparing it to the best option, of that type of card, or they look at it just for the card by itself. But no Magic game has ever existed, where cards have been by themselves. Context matters.
Yes.
And a card like this makes it abundantly clear. So, moving on to the next one, I don't have much to say about this one. Is Scute Swarm. Uh, the one where when a land enters, make a 1/1. If you control 6 or more lands, make a token that's a copy of Scute Swarm instead. And it is a 1/1 for 3. Card is playable, I would say. Uh, I think it can get out of hand pretty fast. It's also a payoff for Scape Shift in Pioneer without Field of the Dead, um, on turn 7.
Hmm.
Where you play this on turn 7 for 3 mana. You hit your land drop. You make a token that's a copy of it. You play Escape Shift and you make 14 copies of Scute Swarm or whatever. So it's not quite Field of the Dead because it requires you to already have it, and we already have other cards that work with Escape Shift. But the fact that this is 3 mana and also works even without Escape Shift, it kind of does what a lot of the green decks want to do anyway.
And I mean,
It's
if you're
kind of
really
cool.
getting to that point with Scape Shift, you're probably just killing them.
Well, it,
I mean,
I mean, yes, but yeah, exactly. Like this card works totally fine with like even in standard too. Like
yeah,
if you make one token of this and then you play a land the next turn, that's 2 tokens, and the land the next turn is 4 tokens. It can actually get out of hand pretty fast, I think. So,
yeah,
and
no,
you don't
this,
need 6 tokens or 6 lands for this card to actually make tokens. Like, sure, they're not copies of it, but against an aggressive deck, you're still making a 1/1 every turn, which, as we know, is good enough against some aggressive draws. So, I like this card a lot.
I think it's definitely very deceptive. The 1/1 stats obviously are not very good for 3, but
Yes.
it almost feels kind of like a tireless tracker, kind of one of those grindy attrition
Or a
style
pack
ones,
rat, but
or a
obviously
pack rat.
it doesn't accelerate Empower Toughness in
It
killing your
does not.
opponent, but it still can take over the game.
It can,
It
and
requires
I
more
mean,
work though, but
it does. But you're making land drops, and if you get to enough point, like the card clearly, you know, has potential to do. I mean, a single card that could potentially win you the game is always something to consider. Like
yeah,
if the
absolutely.
game goes on long enough and they don't answer this, that it's just going to take everything over is clearly something to consider.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I like cards like this because one of my favorite cards, as you may have known, you in particular, is Dragon Master Outcast, which I have played in many Arclight Phoenix lists. But I like cards like that where they're reasonable-ish early game creatures that pay off for hitting land drops later in the game. I like cards like I love Tireless Tracker and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean I think this card's deceptive, but I think it has a pretty high ceiling. So we'll see how low the floor is with it, though. I would be surprised if this card didn't see play in standard. And now a card like this might not be a main deck card, for example,
Yeah,
right? It might be a card that's a great sideboard card in a variety of green decks because maybe you bring it in against decks that are trying to maybe you bring it in against aggressive decks and maybe you bring it in against control decks, but you probably don't want it against green ramp mirrors or mid-range decks, right?
yeah,
So, so maybe it's a sideboard card, but I
yeah.
think
My
the
only
card has a
fear
lot
is
of
it kind of
potential.
gets caught in that biogenic ooze era of, or kind
Yes.
of like mush of like it's just not quick enough, and there's too many answers, and it's just not it's not impactful enough when it comes down.
Right.
It kind of has those
I mean,
obvious things that can be wrong, and that's the only thing that kind of holds me back from just
yeah, I
saying
mean
this card's
the
obviously like a slam dunk.
yeah, the trade-off to that is it's 3 mana rather than 4 or
Exactly.
5, right? So it's a little earlier in the game you could potentially invest the mana into it. But yeah, exactly. And Tireless Tracker has a better stat line, and drawing you a card can be worth more than a random 1/1. So, yeah. I mean, but yeah, it's a card that I think is worth thinking about.
Do you think this card is better than Tireless Tracker when you're making the copy?
Um, that's a good question. I don't really know how to compare the two.
Just in
Um,
terms of like, it seems pretty comparable,
I
if
mean,
not a little better. Like,
if so, this is better than Tracker, I think, if you're playing fetch lands. Or if you're cracking a
okay,
fabled passage, if that makes sense.
yeah,
Because the thing with Tireless Tracker in obviously we don't you can't play it in standard, but uh, in modern in particular where it sees more play than in Pioneer, though it does still see some play in Pioneer. In both of those formats, and Tireless Tracker actually sees play in Legacy as well, but in those formats, it's very rare for Tireless Tracker to be main deck. It's usually a sideboard card for one.
yeah, especially nowadays,
Yes, and
for
it's
sure.
also harder sometimes to actually use all the clues
Yeah,
because spending mana can be tough. Um, so with a fetch land, if you get to 6 lands, you could play a fetch land and crack it, and that's going to give you're going to have 4/1/1s off of that, right? So like it might be better, but the I think the so and that would be copies of it, but even if you play it on turn 4 and you play a fetch land, you have this as a 1/1 and then you have 2 insect tokens, so that might like be pretty comparable. I think it's astronomically better if you're making copies than Tireless Tracker in a format with fetch lands,
yeah,
but if you're not making copies, I think it's worse.
yeah.
So I'm not sure how I would like equate the two to compare them in playability.
No, I
um,
just thought I'd throw it out
yeah.
because I think it's a pretty interesting question. In terms of just where this card kind of like has the potential. Because obviously, I think Tireless Tracker is kind of
The gold standard.
the the gold standard for like what you would want. I want to play a land, and my creature with landfall is going to do something really good. So
Right.
like, where does that card kind of compare? And I think it's pretty like even the fact that you have to like kind of compare it is really like kind of says a lot about this card's power level.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I think that's a good point. I like this card a lot at any rate, so I'll probably be jamming into the list and see what we can do with it. But yeah, I mean, I think cards like this in general usually find a home. So, all right, so the next one that I have up here is I know you love this card. Well, I don't know if you love it, but you at the very least, I know you think very favorably of this card. Is Magmatic Channeler. Um, the 2 mana 1/3. If there's 4 more instants, it gets +3/+1. And tap, discard a card, exile top 2. You can play one.
I mean, are there people that don't like this card?
Well,
Like, is that is there somebody out there that reads this card and is like, "No, this card sucks." Like clearly this card is good. Like how good I can't say, but like just reading it, if you're paying 2 mana for what is essentially in most formats, probably even standard, is a 2 mana 4/4 that you can
Well, is it
discard
though?
and draw.
In what standard format is this a 2 mana 4/4?
I'm talking more in context of like if we get to some point in standard where this card is legal.
You mean like in a week?
Maybe not on two.
Oh, okay.
Maybe not
Well,
on
okay, that's
two,
that's that's more of
but
what I'm getting at
yeah,
is this card in modern, for example, is probably a 2 mana 4/4, right?
yeah.
In modern, for example. But one thing I think a lot I do think this card is good. Okay. I'm not going to disagree with that. But I do think a lot of people are somewhat misevaluating this card. And what I mean by that is if it's a 4/4, you basically can't ever think of it as something that lets you filter through your deck, right? You kind of have to pick one, if that makes sense. So, if you're saying, "Oh, this is like a 2 mana 4/4 in these aggressive decks," well, yes, it can be, but the cost of making this card a 4/4 is you effectively no longer get to use the card selection. So, but a lot of people are kind of evaluating it as it's a 4/4 that can draw you cards, which I don't think, strictly speaking, is accurate.
No, I definitely don't think it's a 4/4 that draws cards, but it potentially
Right.
can, if you need to draw cards, it
You
can
can.
be that
Yes.
option while also being a 4/4 option. That's
Yeah.
it's not doing everything at one time, but the
It
flexibility of it
correct.
obviously
Is nice.
is
Yes.
is is nice to have, especially, the fact that you discard a card and it
Well,
feels
yeah, it
itself
feel.
is
I was just
nice.
gonna bring that up. It fuels itself in a way that lets you kind of cheat on mana. So you play this as a 2 mana 1/3, which is actually a pretty reasonable stat line even in older formats. And you can kind of just you can cast a spell, and then discard a spell, untap, kill their guy, and attack for 4. Right. So it's actually pretty reasonable to turn this on turn 4. I think even in like say standard, right? So yeah, exactly. And so I think this card is actually quite good because it's a utility 2 drop that transitions into a beater. But I have seen a lot of people talk about it as it being more of a beater. Like this is definitely not like a glint sleeve siphoner type beater where it hits your opponent for a reasonable amount and like does stuff. This isn't like a Tarmogoyf either. This is oh, it's kind of a Dreadhorde Arcanist that grows. I think is how I kind of evaluate the card. Um,
Yeah,
but
I
yeah,
think that's fair.
I think the card is good. I don't think it's as easy to put into a lot of decks as people think. For example, I don't know how many decks will feel comfortable putting this card into their deck when they're never feasibly going to make it a 4/4, for example.
Yeah.
So you know it.
It's just
So
this card is obviously like you just look at it and you're like, this card has to fit somewhere.
well, yeah,
Does it fit
yeah.
in everything? Like no, but I do think it's like the dread. I feel like it is in that same vein as Dreadhorde Arcanist, where it's like that's a powerful effect, and in the right circumstances, this card's really good. And
Right.
that's kind of like where I would have where I
The
would put it.
the other thing too that I think is worth mentioning with this is I think it has a lot of potential in standard in particular because uh, it being a utility creature and an aggressive like it just being a good 2 drop obviously is much better in that format where you're less likely to have to compete with other 2 drops. So and what I mean by that is if I'm in Pioneer and I'm looking at Rakdos Pyromancer, okay, I can't cut Croxa and I probably can't cut Young Pyromancer. How many Dreadhorde Arcanists can I cut? Can I afford to play 16 2 drops? It's easier in standard to play 16 or 22 drops, than it is in other formats. So
Yeah,
kind of the way we talked about the Seagate card, that it may be difficult for some decks to actually find room for this card.
yeah,
So it's not like an easy shoe in I think in a lot of decks, but I think this card is quite good. But I do think a lot of people do need to kind of slow it down when they come to evaluating this card, in that it's not just a slam dunk index. So, but obviously in standard, like, I don't. There might be a red deck that doesn't play this. You
Yeah,
know,
there very well could be.
if you
If
can't ever make it a 4/4, like maybe you
if you
don't play
can't
it,
make this
right?
card a 4/4, I don't think you're playing it.
In
I don't think it's
standard,
that good.
you might play it in the sideboard if you can't make it a 4/4,
You might I could
because a
potentially see that. I mean,
utility 2 drop
the
is totally
discard
fine.
and the fact that you get to see two cards is also
Yeah.
really good.
Well, so you could play this against aggressive decks, right? Brick wall their early creatures, and then just win the game with this on, even if it's never becomes a 4/4, because you just always find a card that you need, right? So you get to turn all your bad draws into like relevant cards. So I mean, maybe in standard you play this even if you can't make it a 4/4, but I don't think in other formats you're going to play this if you can't make it a 4/4.
Yeah,
Like, and I don't think a deck that goes heavy on Treasure Cruise would want to play this card in Pioneer, for example.
probably
Like,
probably not. But then your deck is playing Treasure Cruise,
well,
so
yeah.
I don't think you're crying too much.
Well, this is true, but also this card is a wizard, so wizard's lightning. Anybody? So
Yeah, Pioneer Lightning Bolt.
dude, let's do it. I mean, mono red wizard like aggro wanted an actual good wizard at 2 mana, so that's
Look,
nice.
is it Wizards? I played against it in Phoenix, so you know, Pioneer meta deck just got a new wizard.
Dude, the best one. Well, I mean, it got two new wizards, right?
It got a lot of wizards in
Yeah,
this
it did.
set,
It
right?
did.
You know,
And actually, one of the standard decks I brewed up is actually a 4 magmatic channeler, 4 of the Seagate like shell, which is, and it actually like seemed like reasonable. Um, so the next one I want to talk about, I have very little to say about this one, is Legion Angel. Card is super unique. I like this design space a lot, utilizing the sideboard. That was what I liked about Companion, was there's a theoretical tension with Companion because it limits your post board games, but in reality it doesn't, because you just always draw your sideboard card, if that makes sense. But
hmm
I've talked about that before. But anyway, a card like this I think is really interesting design wise. It also, being a warrior, I think is super relevant, because not only can you play it in, say, in standard in like any of the warrior aggro decks, where now you just have this. Not only do you have an like a bunch of 4/3 angels now you can play, but it also gets like some tribal benefits. It also counts for parties. So one of the things I was doing with a lot of early party shells in standard was I was playing one copy of Legion Angel in the deck to grab off of coveted prize.
yeah.
So then
I
you
was
could,
gonna ask you how
yeah,
many Legion Angel do you play in the main board?
yeah.
Because
So
obviously that's kind of a now you have a contention of how many potential free draws you get by playing maybe one, and then you play
right.
three in the sideboard, maybe two and two.
So it's
I play three, and then I can draw one.
right.
It's interesting in that regard.
Exactly. So I think in standard it's not cut and dry as to how many you play, right? Like there's no way you play 4, right? You know, but
Yeah,
but yeah, 3 and 1 I think is pretty reasonable in a deck that's like Boros Warriors, for example, where you really only need the first one to give you an extra one. Like you don't really need the third. You don't need the second free one, if that makes
yeah,
sense, right? But yeah, I mean in Pioneer, if you're playing it with coveted prize, you can get away with just one. Even in standard, if you're playing a party deck with coveted prize, you could. It's pretty low cost to put one Legion Angel into your deck and 3 into your sideboard, because then you can just coveted prize for Legion Angel against like the grindier decks, and then now you just Legion Angel into Legion Angel into Legion Angel, and that could be good enough against a control deck or like a slower mid range deck. But
yeah. I
yeah,
mean,
I
is
mean
there any world where you play literally four of this in your sideboard, and you throw in one after sideboarding or some amount?
it's
It's
possible.
just an
Yeah,
interesting way to
yeah,
think about this kind of card. I definitely
absolutely.
agree that this design space is, it's nice to kind of get some kind of like a little exploratory into the sideboard stuff that isn't the companion. Um, I'm a little surprised that they kind of printed this card after the whole fiasco, because
Yeah, well, I mean
just in terms of like, oh, we don't want to
well,
bring in bring up sideboard cards
I
again
mean,
that you can play
the
from your
the difference with
and things
this
like that.
is this doesn't start in your opening hand, right? So
Oh
the
yeah,
better value this
no,
card gives, the more inconsistent it was, right?
yes.
So that actually is super awesome, I think.
They just
And
don't even want to. They don't even want people to remember playing cards from your
sideboards don't
side.
exist.
Sideboard.
Best of
Look,
one only,
we're already throwing out the sideboard, going to best of one already. So we don't even want to acknowledge the sideboard.
right? Best of one with companions though.
Whew.
All right, so yeah, Legion Angel super cool, awesome with coveted prize. It's one of the interesting things you can do in standard. Probably coveted prize plus Legion Angel not good enough in Pioneer, but it's probably something that you'll see a little bit in Standard. It's pretty low cost, I think, because even if you're a deck that isn't playing white and you're playing coveted prize, you can still just put one Legion Angel in your deck, you know, so, and you can like play some like splash white dual lands or whatever, like.
Yeah.
So because then late game, like really, Legion Angel is a card that you're looking at in mid range or aggro decks when you're running out of gas and you're just like, here's a threat, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if 2/2 is the norm, um, because it's not a card you always want to draw, right? Like
Yeah.
4/3 flying for 4 is kind of whatever.
Yep.
Um,
Pretty meh.
there's a big difference between 4/3 and 4/4, so it's not a card you always want to draw, but and you don't want to load up your hands with like multiple copies of it, right? That feels
Yes.
kind of bad. So I wouldn't be surprised if 2/2 is the norm, or if a lot of decks just play one in the main, three in the sideboard, because you're gonna draw your one of in maybe like 20 or 30% of your games, and then the card's fantastic, right? So I think those are probably going to be the most common. But I could see 3-1. I could actually see 2-1, depending on how much sideboard space you want to preserve.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, just the
but
fact that there's so many different ways you can
Oh
go with
yeah,
the card.
is really interesting. I think the most common one I've built decks with is 1 and 2 or 1 and 3 because I've been playing it with coveted prize. But generally speaking, the card is playable without that. So, but yeah, it's super interesting card. I love this design. So the next one I want to talk about, we had kind of mentioned it. I think at the beginning, or maybe it was before we started the stream, or whatever, is Confounding Conundrum. And yeah, we had alluded to this, that like maybe this was a card they had snuck in after seeing the like dominance of Growth Spiral and Uro, right?
Yep.
Because if they had suspected those before, they probably would have put this in before, right? Because it normally they don't like to put the hate cards that are powerful in the same set as the cards that they're hating on, right?
Yeah.
So, but they usually wait one set. But this was waiting 3 sets, right? So this would be the
Gotta
third
look.
set after Uro. So like I'm not
Yeah.
sure, right? So there was maybe enough time for them to sneak it in. Maybe it was actually better against Growth Spiral, but I think there's some critical issues with this card that doesn't quite address against those cards enough. Is one, it's a blue card, right? So you can't put it in every deck in the way that Damping Sphere can go into sideboards or Graph Digger's Cage. So you do have to be playing blue to actually get this type of effect to mitigate that. It also isn't symmetrical, so the Growth Spiral and Uro decks have an incentive to play this card anyway because it can kind of be a mirror breaker in that
Yes.
sense. However, I do really like the card because it does replace itself, so it's never quite dead. We've seen cards that are kind of niche cards that cantrip see play before, like Ground Seal saw main deck play and sideboard play when it was standard legal. Confounding Conundrum, I could see seeing standard main deck standard play in some of the decks, and I'm sure it'll see sideboard play. It
Yeah.
also works quite well against Fabled Passage too, which is well, sort of. They can't use the Fabled Passage on their turn, but they can
Yeah.
wait till your turn. But the other thing is Yorion can blink it to draw a card, which is super cool. So it does give you like some of the slower decks, maybe they can negate value. But the other thing I wanted to note about Confounding Conundrum is you compare it with Field of Ruin, and they play their land drop, and then on end step you Field of Ruin them. So
Yeah. That's.
eh,
I mean,
yeah.
it's pretty interesting. The really, I don't like the fact that this card draws a card.
Mm.
I'm not too. You know me. I'm not too keen on those kinds of like. Let's. I feel like if this card was warranted enough to be, see play, then it shouldn't have the draw card. It
Well,
should just be in a meta game that's where this card will be good, it should be
I mean, I would never play this
playable
card
in
without
that.
the draw card at 2 mana, right?
Yeah,
At 1 mana,
where
maybe, right?
because I don't know, maybe I'm just poisoned by the kind of the standard metagame that we're in right now with 4 Aether Gusts in the main boards. But you know how I feel about those kinds of hate
Yeah,
cards where
yeah. I mean,
they're just generically like they're just good. Like even if they don't work all the time, it's just like this is kind of feels like I'm not saying it's
well,
anywhere
so
near that level, but the fact that we're kind of like, do you just potentially just play this in your deck because it's just a 2 mana, it cycles itself and it's just a permanent? Like,
well, yeah. So the other thing I want to mention is most hate cards are actually awful, right? And they're terrible at doing their job. And so I think this card is low impact even against the Uro decks. It's obviously on curve solid against Uro, right? It's totally fine against Uro Fabled Passage decks, but it doesn't really hose them, if that makes sense. So
yeah,
I think cards like this, if they're colored, need to actually draw a card or do something else. That's how I feel about these cards because it's not an instant. It's a
yeah,
permanent, right? If it's like a Veil of Summer card, it doesn't need the draw card. I think there's a big difference between something being an instant or having flash as a hate effect because then it only matters when it matters, right?
yeah,
Whereas this card, you have to play it and then your opponent gets the decision, right? So they're never going to run into it if that makes sense. And
yeah,
the punishment that they get is it just undoes what they did anyway, right? It doesn't set them farther behind, right? So I actually think this particular card needed the draw card to actually be remotely playable.
yeah. I just, oh, my
I
feelings on
do.
hate cards, and it's
I
just
do.
like
But
it's such a
this is
fickle, it's such a fine line for this kind of thing that I read it. It's something. It's kind of just an interesting way to look about it. Is like I really hope that we don't just see this card seen play because like maybe I'll just catch the one, you know, the landfall deck or some deck that takes advantage of doing multiple land drops in a turn just because it's good enough. I'm
well,
really hoping that that's not
what
the
decks
case.
can afford to pay 2 mana to just draw a card?
I don't know. Again,
I mean,
like
it's
I'm more
at the
talking
moment it's
in
not
a
very many.
hypothetical world of some future standard.
Well, yeah, I mean, I expect this card to see maybe you play one copy in the main deck. I'm not saying this card won't see main deck play, right?
Yeah,
But if this card would see main deck play, yes, it would see main deck play. You know, in a variety of situations. But you know, I don't. I think part of what makes this card playable is the fact that it draws a card because its hating is so low impact. And I think that's the important thing I think to realize is this isn't like a Blood Moon card. This isn't like a Veil of Summer or an Ether
yeah.
Gust where it completely blows your opponent out, right?
I've just been scarred.
So
I've been
I know
scarred too much.
this is
It's just I
more
see these things and I get scared.
yeah this
But
is
you're
more
right.
like Ground
It's not
Seal.
really.
Yeah.
It's a very narrow. It's a very narrow hate card where it's hating a very particular thing.
Yes.
It's and so it's. I could definitely see them having to put the draw card on. I'm just gonna be. It's one of those. It's one of those lines, and I don't like to. I don't even like to get near it. So I totally respect what the card does. It's just if people start playing four of it, I'm gonna be real mad.
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
the. They messed up. They messed up somewhere. That's the.
look, you're probably going to see this card main deck in Uro decks, right? Or
That's the
or
even
Yorion decks.
worse. That's
But
even worse. The
okay,
fact that they just like I get my lands and you don't. Ew.
well,
That's just gross.
I mean, yeah. So and to that token, yes, it it is in a way Veil of Summer in the Uro mirrors, right? But it's
Yeah.
not in a sense, right? Your opponent does still get to do stuff, right? They still get
Yeah.
to play their own things. They get to still interact with you. So it's again it's more in the vein of Ground Seal or Soul Guide Lantern in terms of hate. In the fact it's not strong piece of hate, but the ability to cycle it is what makes it actually somewhat appealing. Like you would never play Soul Guide Lantern over Tormod's Crypt if it didn't have the option to draw a card, right?
Yeah.
So in a similar way, Confounding Conundrum is I think it fills a similar role as Ground Seal, where in certain metagames you'll play it main deck, but that's often when things are getting degenerate. But it doesn't shut things off in the way that Veil of Summer would, right? So, or it I don't think it's as toxic a hate card as Ether Gust, right? So,
Yeah.
which I'm tired of that card in every format. Just, but
Gosh,
yeah.
yeah.
So the next one, I'm gonna skip over Coveted Prize, because I've kind of mentioned that with a lot of the other
Yeah,
party
we've
cards.
talked about that
Um,
when it's kind of
I'm gonna skip over Lotus Cobra, but I am gonna say one thing: fuck Lotus Cobra. It's one of my least favorite Magic cards ever printed. Um, Card is, I will say maybe a sentence or two on it. It's not as good in Pioneer and Standard, as it was before. That's really all I have to say about it. But is it good in Standard? Yes, very good. I think it's like Paradise Druid level good, where you play it in almost all the green decks. But is it broken? No. In Pioneer, it's pretty good, but it's I don't think it's as good as a lot of people are saying. So. Oh, but fuck Lotus Cobra. I hate that card so much. Oh, do you have any thoughts on the card coming to those
no.
formats or
It's obviously good.
yeah.
It's a green card that ramps more stuff we need.
It does mana fix too, which is actually
Yeah,
relevant in the standard format. So,
it's obviously good.
yeah.
I mean, what else is there to say? The card will see play. It'll ramp up into something egregious, and so
Yep.
it's good.
So there's a lot of other cards that I think we'll see constructed play that I'm skipping over here. Um, And there's some that I didn't even put on the list that I think we'll see constructed play, like Tajuru Paragon or Hagra Mauling. These are all like cards that fit the benchmark of playability. But the next one I want to talk about is Swarm Shambler. So I was very excited when I saw this card because I am a big fan of hardened scales that's more like a mid-rangey stompy deck rather than like a Voracious Hydra combo deck. And I'm also excited when Standard gets one drops that are pretty good in the late game. And what I mean, or that like scale into the late game in the sense that like if I play Swarm Shambler on turn one, I can just grow it every turn. So it's more than a one drop, if that makes sense. So I like this card a lot. I think it's really good for hardened skills decks in non-standard formats because part of the drawback of hardened skills decks was if you kill their first couple creatures, oftentimes they just lose the game, right? So now they get to keep a board state, which is pretty cool. So
Yeah, I mean, this card is it's kind of in that same vein that we've seen recently of like Knight of the Ebon Legion, Pelt Collector, these
mm-hmm.
one drops that are just clearly like very good. The only drawback with this one is it kind of has this synergy with the +1/+1 counters, but there is that kind of thing that they're doing in standard now with +1/+1 counters. It's been kind of fringe for a little bit, but you push enough cards like this, and
Yep.
eventually it's gonna be good.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know,
I one of the standard decks I'm probably gonna put in the dump tomorrow is a plus one counters deck. So, yeah, I mean we have Conclave Mentor, so how unplayable can the shell be, right?
yeah, and I think the fact that it's one mana is pretty disgusting.
Yep.
Like these kind of effects have just always seen play, at least in standard, on a one mana. Like these mostly see play, and they're usually pretty good in the decks they are played in. Like
Yeah.
it's gonna be if there's a deck that plays this card's gonna be like if you get it on one, clearly it's gonna be really good. But then if you get in any other time, it's kind of a little bit even more swingy, where I would say like even more so than like a Pelt Collector, where this card in the right deck is probably better than Pelt Collector.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pelt Collector is probably more generically better because it's just more playable in
Yeah,
more
I mean
decks.
any two
But
drop basically is good with Pill Collector, right? So
exactly, but this card has a much higher ceiling, so this card could
right.
potentially be even like
So I I,
more nuts.
I think an important thing with this card is obviously it draws comparisons to Hanger Backwalker, right? In terms of what the text on the card does, but
Yep.
the difference, however, is Hanger Backwalker scales on the front end in the
Yeah.
fact that if I draw this and I have 8 mana, I now have a 4/4 Hanger Backwalker that makes 4 tokens when they kill it. Swarm Shambler is still only ever making one token, and only if it's and only when it becomes the target of a spell, so it dying in combat won't give you a token, which does mean that your opponent has more counterplay to it, but at the same time, there's totally room for a weaker Hanger Backwalker to be a very, very good card, right? So,
Yeah,
um,
there's a lot of room
yeah.
for cards worse than Hanger Backwalker to see play.
Yes. So there is a distinction that it is easier for your opponent to manage this card. But on the plus side, this kind of protects all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters. So it kind of gives you a +1/+1 counter payoff in the fact that if any spot removal is going to always give you a 1/1. So,
And I mean,
which
if
is
they
kind
have
of
to use
nice.
spot removal on your one drop, then
Feeling
you
great.
know, you're feeling pretty good.
Yep.
Especially if you're making a 1/1 from your one mana card. Like,
Yep. So, the the next one I'm going to talk about, I'm mostly going to talk about this card because I think it has vintage and legacy applications to it, though it does have applications, though small in standard and a reasonable amount in modern and pioneer, is Thieving Skydiver. So this is the one where if it's kicked, you gain control of an artifact with CMC X or
yep,
less. So the obvious implication with this card is X can't be 0 with the kicker, right? However, this card is still going to be. My suspicion is quite good in Vintage, and I know you don't know much about Vintage, but generally speaking, you get to play the Moxen and Black Lotus and Soul
yeah,
Ring and all of these
some pretty good
Yes.
artifacts.
So actually, Vintage is a format where main deck artifact destruction is actually pretty reasonable. Ancient Grudge is a main deck card
Yeah,
in a lot of Vintage formats. So, and Thieving Skydiver, Dak Faden, for example, as the Planeswalker, was for quite a while was quite good in Vintage, and it still is like pretty solid in Vintage. And a lot of that came with because you could play it and immediately steal their mana and just set them behind. So it was kind of like a wasteland that also then won the game for you as the game went on. And drawing two, discarding two is pretty huge in a format like Vintage when you actually have a lot of cards to pitch and you can still play Treasure Cruise and dig through time and things of that nature. So Thieving Skydiver doesn't quite do that, but it is a creature which actually can matter in a format that has, generally speaking, fewer removal spells and fewer creatures. So creatures are more likely to actually be able to get in for damage if they have moderate disruption. And it also doesn't require red, so you can fit it into slightly more decks. So it is easy to still play 3 or 4 color blue decks in Vintage. But and the reason I bring this up is because while X can't be 0, you do gain control of an artifact with CMC X or less, so you can still pay
yeah,
3 mana to take over a Moxen, right? Which is pretty
yeah.
comparable to if you played Dak Faden and stole their Moxen. So, but one of the differences, of course, is with Thieving Skydiver, if you target an equipment, obviously it gets significantly better. But so I mostly want to bring this card up because this card has a lot of potential in Vintage in particular, and moderate potential in Legacy and Modern because there are some amount of artifacts that are worth taking, for example. Um, like Darksteel Citadel in Modern, it doesn't crop up a ton anymore. Artifact decks aren't as popular, but there are still a decent amount. And, it because this card is constrained by the mana, it's not as good against cards like Batterskull as it would be against, like, I don't know, Shadow Spear or maybe like a small artifact creature that you can take. So there,
Yeah.
and it is pretty good against Urza's constructs because you can at least take the construct, and that maybe gives you something, right? So
Yeah.
it does give you a way to mitigate it, but it by far I think shines in Vintage and in Pioneer. In Pioneer, there's actually more artifact decks in the form of Ensoul Artifact than there are in Modern in terms of metagame percentage.
Yep.
You actually play against the Soul Artifact a good amount because there's far fewer answers to it. There's no like Path to Exiles or anything like that. So being able to take their Darksteel Citadel in a way that they can't Stubborn Denial, I think actually is pretty huge for some of the blue decks in that format. It's also a rogue for a relevant creature type potentially, but yeah. So I think it is a card that will mostly shine in Pioneer and Vintage, but every format there are some decks that play artifacts, and you can also play it with your own equipment as well, like a Colossus Hammer, and you can just put that on this guy for on turn 3. So you could do that in Modern, and you could potentially do that in Pioneer now as well. So yeah, I mean, I would expect this card to see a reasonable amount of sideboard play. I think in every format. So I don't know. It's mostly the vintage thing. Is this card's I think gonna be pretty good in that
I mean, the
format.
card has a very unique effect. Just the fact that it's kicker X,
Yes.
it's it's very interesting. The card has obviously in vintage. There's just a lot of obvious targets that this is going to be, but depending on the metagame, depending on where Magic goes, this card could pop up in 3, 4, 5 years and be like, "Hey, remember this card? This card would be really good right now."
Yeah. I mean,
It's
what
like
if
one
they
of those
print
effects that's kind of
another?
timeless.
Yeah. What if they print another card like Colossus Hammer? Right. Now all of a sudden, like a card like this might actually just be like a phenomenal card, right? Like, and yeah, like the more artifacts get printed, the better cards like this are, right?
Yeah,
So, and this can also steal a Stonecoil Serpent, no matter how big it is, which actually might be more relevant in Pioneer than taking like a Dark Citadel or whatever. So, you know, it, and that actually could be relevant in Standard, taking a Stonecoil Serpent, right?
yeah,
So if you're playing against an aggressive deck and they've got like Stonecoil and like Shadow Spear, this is probably pretty reasonable to board in. So
yeah.
yeah, I
It's
mean,
definitely like a very, this effect is probably it's like something that can apply to any format, in some context, some level, which is, it's pretty cool.
does the printing of Lotus Cobra bring the 4-color copycat deck from Modern into Pioneer? Well, is the copycat deck is the Feldar one, right? The one that card's banned, so they can't actually translate it. But I mean, Lotus Cobra opens up potentially some archetypes, um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I like Theming Skydiver a lot. Unique card, and unique cards that are reasonably playable almost always make it somewhere. So, all right. So the next one I have, it's the last for like this section, this like big section of cards that I absolutely like had to talk about. Um, is Skyclave Apparition. It's the 3 mana 2/2. You can exile up to one target non-land non-token permanent you don't control. Seems you 4 or less. It draws some comparison to like Deputy of Detention, for example, but obviously instead of exiling all of them, it only exiles one, but they don't get the card back. They get a token back. So I think this card is another one that is relevant because of potentially eternal formats like Legacy, because oftentimes it's better to just give them a random token than it is to actually give them their card back. And you don't typically see too many effects like this that exile non-land permanents attached to creatures. So at least not mono white ones. Like Deputy of Detention obviously can see play, but it being mono white is relevant. It being a spirit is actually relevant in a world of in Pioneer where you have something like Rattle Chains, for example. Like yes, it's not a flyer, but you can flash it in and it has hexproof. So and in Standard, cards like this are typically just good anyway. Deputy of Detention was just a good card, right? Reflector Mage was just a good card. So and even things like Banisher Priest or Fairgrounds Wardens saw like a good amount of play. Fairgrounds Wardens saw a lot of play in Mardu vehicles, for example. So I would expect this card to see a lot of play in Standard, actually. So, and I think it'll see a good amount of play in Pioneer and some play in Legacy as well. So, but I like cards like this a lot. So, yep. And the other thing that you can do with this card is you can do some like crazy shenanigans where you like cast Coco, put Skyclave Apparition in, exile their stuff, and then maybe you can like bounce their token or whatever. Like if they kill the Skyclave or whatever. So because they may not get a window to actually kill Skyclave if you untap with it. Like say your spell color deck, like or your a deck with rattle chains, like they may just have to kill it on end step, and then you maybe get a window to do that. So and then it makes cards like Reflector Mage and stuff better. But there's only so many slots for the type of effect. But I'm usually happy when they print these semi-unique removal spell effects onto relatively weak bodies, because I don't particularly like it when like a really efficient body also gets a really powerful effect. But I do really enjoy it when we see somewhat weaker creatures that have really powerful effects, because there's just more tension in the deck building, I think. So um, I I'm expecting this card to be one of the more chase rare type cards in the way the Deputy of Detention was. So, and then so Tony needed a little bit of time, so I'm just going to talk about some
No, we're
more.
good.
Okay, so
Yeah.
um, that's basically like my thoughts on that card, Skyclave Aberrations. It's not really like a unique card, but it kind of just does stuff that we already have had access to, but it does it a little differently and in monocolors. So I think it's a card that's going to slam dunk see play, and it may even see play in Legacy and more Eternal formats. So where the giving them a token after they exile or kill your guy doesn't really matter as much. So, but yeah, I mean, also like being a spirit, anything that has spirit stapled on, you always have to take a second look at it now.
Yeah, for
Because
sure.
yeah, but um, so most for the most part, it's mostly uncommons that are left on the list. So I'm not sure how many I actually want to talk about, but we haven't talked about any of the multicolor cards, so I'll probably just skip ahead to those, um, and then we'll see how we feel after that. So for the multicolor cards, there's a couple that I think are interesting. So first up, I'm gonna mention Omnath, and I don't really want to talk about Omnath, but it is one of those cards that is so obviously pushed to see play. It just does a bunch. The landfall is really good. It draws you a card when it enters. It's got a reasonable stat line, but it's four colors, so I don't think there's really like much interesting that you can say about it, because it's not like, oh, what kinds of decks can Omnath go in. It kind of just has to go in a four color deck that's somewhat built around it. So,
You play it in Niv Mizzet.
well, right. So you play it in decks that are 4 or 5 color, right? So that's kind of why I don't really want to talk about it much. It's kind of not really an interesting card in that vein, because it's kind of like in the way that I think Niv Mizzet Reborn isn't an interesting card,
Yeah,
because
I
it
mean,
can
we all
only go
know
right,
what
only
kind
go
of
into
card Niv Mizzet's gonna be.
exactly. So and I think Omnath is in a similar vein. Like you don't get questions of, oh, do I play an aggro deck with this? What if I play a control deck? Like those things don't exist. Are you playing all four of those colors? Do you play lands? All right, put Omnath in your deck. Like so, that's why I don't really want to talk about that card. But it is worth mentioning that that card is a playable card.
Also, 4 mana or 4 color commander and EDH.
This is true.
Check mark, important to some people.
So I do want to mention Nissa though. We had like briefly mentioned when we were talking about Jace that we think that Jace is better than Nissa outside of standard. I
Yes.
do think Nissa is better in standard, in particular.
Yeah.
I do think she's quite good in standard. Um, we live in a format with Fabled Passage, so it's actually pretty reasonable to play her like on 5, play Fabled Passage, and immediately use her -5, and that's
Oh,
pretty
for
cool.
sure.
So so because she can take it from hand or graveyard, you can play an Elder Gargaroth. They kill your Elder Gargaroth. You play Nissa, play a land. You get back your Elder Gargaroth. like,
Yeah, I think it's very just super cool that you can, turn 5, you can play your land -5 immediately. I love that option. Um, it's kind of like clearly it pays homage to the to the Nissa that we know now with the 3/3s, but
Yes.
I think the more egregious part of the Nissa of, obviously not being able to double your mana,
Yep.
um, clearly a big downside, but this card is clearly, you know, in a similar vein, not as good, but it's still going to be very good.
Yeah, and I think it is worth noting that I think they've done a lot of things on this card that were really important balance wise. So they kind of learned from the War of the Spark Nissa that making permanent 3/3s is just too good. You can't do that.
Yeah.
It's just way way too good. So this one, they don't have vigilance, so you do have to make the choice of do I untap it to use the mana or do I attack for 3? But it attacks easier, and menace is a really powerful keyword, but it isn't permanent, and I think that's really important for balancing a card like this. That also means it can justify 4 mana a lot better. Also, generally speaking, you were never really worried about Nissa Who Shakes the World of if she only ever made one 3/3. You normally
Yes.
wouldn't care. But the fact that they're permanent means she makes a 3/3 and then it's 2 3/3s, then it's 3 and you're just dead there. So, and that's a big difference than you dying over the course of 7 turns from their 3/3 they make over and over. The
Yeah.
other the
It's a
Yeah.
lot different when, the Nissa that we have now makes 3/3s that can end the game, and then they top deck a Hydro Crisis and draw another 10 cards.
Yes,
The
exactly.
Nissa that we have now literally does everything. Just because this
Yes.
Nissa doesn't do everything doesn't make this a bad card. The 5 mana Nissa is, you can make an argument for one of the best 5 mana planeswalkers, you know,
Oh yeah,
if not the
fantastic. Yeah.
best. So it's like,
I mean, she was a planeswalker that actually it felt like your chances of beating her were worse than beating Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, if they untapped with her, because you're like, okay, if I finally kill her, I still have to deal with the 3/3s and whatever like massive fucking board that they put into play. Whereas with Teferi, you're like, if I manage to kill it, I only have to deal with them with one more card a turn rather than like a bunch more. But yeah, exactly.
yeah,
So she's insane, and this one I think is still like quite good. The interaction with Elder Gargaroth is great. Elder Gargaroth is likely to be one of the defining creatures in Standard. In actually every format, like the card is absolutely incredible. It was surprising to me that initially because a card like that Elder Gargaroth isn't actually like a fantastic card. These decks aren't playing it because it's like format defining good. They're playing it because there's enough decks that don't play removal in all of these different formats. And it's also really good against like Mayhem Devil and nonsense like that.
yeah,
But because the question with Elder Gargaroth, you know, why the card wasn't really good in standard for a while was because it doesn't really do anything if your opponent's playing removal spells, right?
yeah,
They kind of just kill it, and it's like, well, you just played your 5 drop and I killed it. So it was mostly relegated to sideboard play, which is still where we see it in most
yeah.
formats, right?
That's where we see it
So
pretty much. It's a pretty consistent sideboard card
right,
against
and
those aggressive decks.
exactly, and that's kind of what we all felt that card would be. Is obviously this card is good against decks that don't play removal, and it's dog shit against decks that do play removal. So you probably just want to sideboard it, right? And that's what most decks do. Nissa, however, somewhat mitigates that because against removal spell decks, now if they kill your Elder Gargaroth, you can just play a land, get it back, right? And then every so many lands that you play, you probably have Fabled Passages in your deck and whatever. Like it allows you to actually start attacking with Elder Gargaroth more, and it's a creature that you can put in with Nissa to kind of cheat on mana. If you could like potentially escape an Uro and then -5 your Nissa to put an Elder Gargaroth into play, and now even if your opponent has a removal spell, they probably can't kill both of them. So Elder Gargaroth is a card that I think it gets a lot better in main decks in standard because of Nissa, because you can actually play Elder Gargaroth and something else in the same turn. That's part of the problem with Gargaroth is if you just play it and they like Murderous Rider it and attack you, you could just die, right? So,
Yeah,
and on on that note, like Nissa also makes a card like Coglaw a lot better as well. Like any of those creatures where you go Nissa like Fabled Passage minus her, put that into play and play another card, like that's pretty appealing, I think. So and I think that's really where this Nissa shines is in those ramp decks, those sort of ramp decks that like aren't actually full on ramp, where they actually play a lot of like pretty powerful creatures that are maybe 6 mana, and in a lot of ways she's kind of like a one turn Fires of Invention. So like obviously nowhere near as broken, but yeah, and like
Yeah.
she doesn't actually win the game on her own in that way either, but she sort of does. You know, the fact that she can pull from graveyard actually means that you could continually buy back these cards. So she does still kind of check off like all the things that make a planeswalker great. Of does she like actually win the game? And in a way, she sort of does, right? But I do think she's far more balanced than a lot of other planeswalkers that we've seen.
Yeah, definitely a set of more balanced planeswalkers than we're used to these days. So,
And watch us say this, and then they end up completely broken.
isn't that how it always is though?
Well,
Is like,
no.
it's like,
I mean, maybe for you, but
oof, big oof.
yeah. The key is just to be more right than you're wrong, right? So,
It's all that matters.
yeah. So, the next multicolor one I wanted to talk about, there's a couple I'm skipping. I'm skipping Grakmaw and Verazal, though I think those cards are. I mean, Grakmaw has like some interesting potential, but I think Verazal is actually quite good because note it doesn't say for each different color of mana spent to cast it. So it actually just is always a 2/2 minimum. You can just play it on turn 2 as a 2/2, which is something I think some people overlooked. It actually just enters with X plus 2 plus one counters on it, basically, which means that it's actually far easier to trigger.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's not a card I really have much to say on. So, it's, I mean, if you have kicker cards that are good, and you play this, maybe you put it in your deck. At the very least, it's always an on-curve creature like Stonekill Serpent. So, Linvala is the one that I really kind of wanted to talk about because she kind of hits all the check marks of a card that could be constructed playable. She has that Selfless Spirit type effect, where she protects your board against
Hmm.
rads. She also giving them hexproof is interesting because you almost never want to give hexproof over indestructible, right?
Yeah.
Because it does a very similar thing with this type of effect. The exception would be like an exile effect or like an Oath of Kaya. Maybe you want to stop them from gaining life by countering the ability. So there's a lot of like weird incidental things. So it's interesting to me that you can choose hexproof, but I actually kind of like it. She is one of the full party payoffs though, and her full party payoff is very good. Just it effectively just detains a non-land permanent is great. You can shut down planeswalkers, you can shut down creatures with it, and it triggers on combat on your turn. So you can like if you play her on the turn where and she gives you full party off the wizard, you can just stop their guy from blocking and attack. So she's actually like gives some of these aggressive decks a way to fight through Uro or Elder Gargaroth that these decks without removal might otherwise struggle against. So which I think is really important for the party decks because they have to play so many creatures. So
Yep.
you can
Right.
also
Definitely.
in eternal formats, well, maybe not eternal, but in non-standard formats, you can grab her off of Collected Company. So you can Coco into Party, which is actually pretty nice. So I think she actually has like pretty reasonable Pioneer application as well.
Yeah. I mean,
So
just the effect of making your creatures indestructible. Selfless Spirit, at least in spirits, is obviously a very good card.
yeah,
So just the
but
fact that
yeah,
Party has the potential to have that same effect, you
yeah,
know,
it's pretty nice, and we
it's
even
very good.
saw
Yeah.
when Selfless Spirit was in Standard, it was just very good on its own.
Exactly.
And we also saw Selfless Spirit make its way into some modern decks, and we also saw it make its way into some Pioneer decks that weren't spirits. Some of the Heliod decks played it, like the Heliod Coco deck in Pioneer played it, and some of the other decks splashing white played it as well. Like there was some Duskwatch Recruiter decks, but even some of the Mono White Devotion decks before Yorion played that card. So it's just a good card. So I would expect Linvala to see you know Obviously, it can't see as much play as Selfless Spirit because it's multicolored, it's 3-drop, it's legendary. There's more drawbacks to it, but it should see consistent play across multiple formats. It's just a good card.
It is a good card.
So the next one I want to talk about, that's it for the multicolor cards for now. The next one I wanted to talk about was Lithoform Engine. So the artifacts in this set are really unique, all things considered, which I think is fantastic. Um, but these the three big ones I would say are Forsaken Monument, Lithoform Engine, and Myriad Construct. You're kidding yourself if you don't think these cards will see play. They will all see play in some form. Maybe they don't all see play in the same format together, but they're all very pushed. And I think they're really the three that I think I want to close on,
Yeah.
because it's been quite a lot of talking, but and these ones also have applications in a large variety of formats. So I'm going to start with Lithoform Engine because it's probably the one that's gotten the most hype. Um, so this card, obviously, Commander player's wet dream. Kind of does
Yeah, I was gonna
what.
say a lot of these, artifact cards have that kind of, you know, commander vibe to them, but Lithoform Engine, I definitely it has a lot of those effects. We've seen kind of these big artifacts that, especially early on in a standard format, um, they actually see more play than I think we've
Yes,
seen sort of like these later ones. These are kind of the prime time for these cards to really see play
absolutely.
because they're just it. These are when they're the most impactful. The decks aren't as efficient as they will be later on. So these kind of big splashy effects, like that's kind of when we're going to see them the most. And these things, they're not like an Aetherworks Marvel kind of thing where it's going to just like completely game change. But Live the Vorm Engine, it has the potential. It does some pretty crazy stuff. So
Yeah, I mean, the it's definitely not a cheap effect in a format like Standard or Pioneer or even Modern, and but this is a card that I think is really important because it obviously it's a command, it's likely to be a commander staple, but we are entering a Standard format where things might slow down a bit, and slow down in terms of like, we're still going to have fast aggressive decks, but like maybe there's actually time to like play something that doesn't do anything immediately, and then like get a complete card advantage engine, because Lithoform Engine is a way to potentially outgrind Uro, for example.
yeah,
Because realistically we've lost a lot of the ways to win the game, with
yeah,
this rotation. So if you start copying, like, if I play this card and I copy it, and well, now I have two aspects of that effect. Like, I don't know, like, yeah, copying a permanent spell you control is expensive because you have to cast a spell and then also copy it. But maybe copying an instant it comes up, but copying a triggered ability is probably the most useful aspect of Lithoform Engine. So I don't know. There's like a lot of cool things you can do with it, but I think the one thing that Lithoform Engine highlights for me is I am really glad that Fires of Invention is banned in Standard, because Lithoform
yeah.
Engine feels like it's really built for Fires of Invention, because you just
This
play
card
fires, you
is
play this, and
absolutely disgusting with fires.
yes,
I mean, there's like these cards are really easy to just like kind of, oh, this is like for commander and stuff. And I've definitely thought that about these kinds of cards, but there's standard formats where I played two Immortal Sun in a main deck,
yes, exactly.
and that card I never thought that I would be playing that even in the sideboard. So, these cards can see play. They're really it's hard, it has to take a very specific metagame for these kind of they come in, they don't do anything to see play, but there are metagames where these cards can really swing the game and just completely just win it for you.
Look, copying a Shark Typhoon cycling trigger is super sick.
You
So,
get more sharks.
right. So,
And more sharks is good.
well, yeah, and so I mostly wanted to bring this up because I do think that this card, while playable in standard, the lithoform engine specifically is actually it would have been phenomenal if we had fires, because you just play fires, you play this, and then you just win the game on fire. Like, you just there,
Yeah.
yeah, and like if you don't win the game, you just have this anyway. It's not hard to understand how this card would be absolutely fucking bananas in fires. So I'm very glad that fires is banned. That being said, fires is not banned in Pioneer, where I do think lithoform engine will see play. Um, so it's very easy. Fires is a pretty reasonable deck in Pioneer right now, and you can kind of just put this in kind of for free, if that makes sense. And then you just set up incredibly because one of the things with lithoform engine is it's not as good in Pioneer fires because you're so planeswalker heavy, but you are still an agent of treachery deck. So like, like maybe you can like I'll Luca and then I'll like copy the ability, and like now I get two agent of treachery. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with lithoform engine in Fires of Invention in Pioneer. But it's also worth noting that like this card might find a home in say Vintage Shops, which plays like Mishra's Workshop and a lot of big mana stuff. Like maybe there's a world in which you play this and that. Like it's very easy for these types of artifacts to also be very good in Vintage and Legacy, which I think it's really important to evaluate Lithoform Engine from that perspective, because it might be good enough, to play in those types of decks. Because it's in those decks, it's different than in Standard and Pioneer, where Lithoform Engine costs 4 mana to play. In those decks, it's really much closer to being like a 1 or a 2 drop. And
Yeah.
if Lithoform Engine is a 1 or a 2 drop, that dramatically changes the impact it has on the game. So, and so maybe it's good enough in those formats. But I mostly just wanted to bring it up because if Fires of Invention wasn't banned, this would be a slam dunk, 2 to 3 of in standard Fires of Invention, which, it's unfortunate that we probably won't ever get to see that, but yeah, I mostly just wanted to posit
Yeah.
that as
I
something to think
mean,
about. But
it's crazy to think that they printed Fires of Invention and we're like, yeah, this card will be fine. Like,
yeah,
it's it's, it's pretty crazy.
yeah, I
But
mean,
yeah, the Fires is banned. This card will probably still see play in
yeah,
some amount.
maybe it's like a sideboard card or whatever, or maybe there's like a big ramp shell or whatever that can play this. The two that I think are more likely to see play than this in standard in particular are Myriad Construct and Forsaken Monument. So I actually have a Forsaken Monument deck list for standard that's actually being put in the deck dump tomorrow. And there's not a ton of colorless creatures that you really want to play, but we've got some solid ones. And it actually, there's enough colorless lands that you can actually use it to kind of jumpstart your mana a ton, to where now you have 10 or 12 mana on the following turn. At the moment, we don't have many payoffs for that, you know, but you can still play Ugin or whatever, or like Stonecoil Serpent, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
Forsaken Monument, I think, also has Pioneer potential, and I think it has slight Modern potential. 5 mana is a lot, though, and it doesn't really win you the game that much, but like
Yeah,
it's a really powerful effect.
it's a power.
So,
Like at some point, this card's going to give you infinite life in modern. Like at
well,
some point, they're
right.
going to print a card that synergizes with this to just like it's going to break. Like at some point,
Yeah,
it's like one of those cards where it's clearly powerful. Somebody probably a lot smarter than me will figure out some genius way to use it.
I
And
mean, I think it's a pretty easy shoe in into like Mystic Forge decks, like so.
oh yeah,
Like it's pretty easy to play one copy of this card and find it, because a lot of those decks just play Karn, so you can just grab this off of Karn, right? Or like,
yeah.
like we, yeah, so exactly. Like there's got to be
I was
some way
gonna
to break
say, do
this
you
card.
just play
Like,
this in a card shell
I
where
mean,
you just essentially get to play it for free? Like
like probably, do you play this in the Etron sideboard? Maybe. I
yeah,
mean,
I
the
mean
the the sideboard's really really tight though, so like maybe you
yeah,
don't, but possibly. We a colorless card that gains you 2 life when you cast a colorless card we have Golem's Heart in Modern, but if you can afford to pay more mana, you want a stronger effect. So like I like this card a lot, and it has a lot of potential for abuse in Standard because we do have enough colorless lands. We just don't have quite enough payoffs yet. That if they give us a payoff that's other than Ugin, to where now we have like 8 payoffs, this might actually be a very dangerous archetype in Standard. So, and I could see it in Pioneer because we have stuff like Ulamog. So it's pretty reasonable to just like play something, play Forsaken Monument, and then just like cast an Ulamog or whatever. Like it's reasonable, I think, in Pioneer to make Forsaken Monument work
Yeah.
as well. So yeah, the other one that I wanted to talk about is probably I would say the best of the three at first glance is Myriad Construct. So this one is really interesting because you don't it doesn't get the same value off of the kicker in every game, right? It's based on how many non-basics your opponent controls.
Yeah.
So this could be a 7 mana like 11/11, right? Which isn't particularly good, but if you're in, say, like, I don't know, like a ramp deck or in Standard or something like that, and you get like 4 or 5 counters on it, that's probably pretty good. They probably have to play a spell to kill it, and then you just get a bunch of 1/1 tokens. So it kind of has a similar thing as the Swarm Shambler that we saw earlier, where there are, abilities can still kill it for free, but if your opponent has to play a Murderous Rider on this, you're still getting a bunch of guys. So I actually think this
Yep.
card will see a lot of Standard play. Because it
Yeah.
doesn't need to be kicked to actually give you 4/1/1s when your opponent kills it.
Yeah.
So,
4 mana, 4/4. You get 4/1/1s. That's just that's a
yeah,
good rate, and
yep,
the fact that it just has kicker, is just icing on that. Like the fact that this could potentially be like a 7, like a even if it's a 7 mana like 7/7 that gets you 7/1/1s.
yeah,
It's like it's the flexibility of it's pretty good, and it's just it goes back to you know the more colorless cards that we get that are good, the better this Forsaken Monument stuff gets, and
exactly.
it all kind of
I
spirals
mean,
from there.
no surprise, in my standard Forsaken Monument deck, I've got 4 Myriad Constructs and some Lithoform engines in it, right? Like those 3 cards work very, very well together, which is super cool. Um, so because the other thing too is if you somehow live in magical Christmas land where you've played Forsaken Monument on 5, you miraculously untap and you have 12 mana and you have a Lithoform engine in play, you can play a Myriad Construct, kick it, and then copy it with Lithoform engine. So now you have 2 kicked Myriad constructs that enter, and then on the next turn potentially you could like when they kill it you could like copy the ability and so like yeah, I mean like Myriad construct is also a card that also has vintage applications because and any, as I mentioned before, any sort of like remotely playable artifact has vintage
Yeah.
applications and legacy applications as well, because you do see cloud post decks and you do see some mud decks occasionally pop up where they want access to these types of effects. And the other thing that's kind of that we'll likely see in modern is this was mentioned by Saffron Olive actually made a Twitter post where he was asking if this worked with Ground Rift and Giga Drowse in a way that gave you multiple triggers. And it does when it becomes the target of a spell, because the sacrificing it isn't mandatory to make the tokens. So since it says sacrifice it and create, you're going to create that amount whether you sacrifice it or not. So, uh,
Oh.
right. So if you have multiple of that trigger, you get that many tokens for each trigger. So it's because it's not an if you do or when you do. So
Yeah,
it's
that
not a
makes sense.
reflexive thing. Yeah. So you can like play this on 4 and then Giga Drowse it 5 times, right? And make like 20 tokens. So, and that's like kind of cool. Maybe that's something that's viable in modern. Who knows? It's a new like a way of approaching the format. So, this card's super cool. I actually expected to see maybe it sees reasonable play in Pioneer as well. Like Pioneer as a format is actually slowing down quite a bit, and despite the fact that Lotus Field is still a deck, it's actually not a particularly good deck, which opens up the room more to like 3 and 4 drops. So and that's something that I think is interesting. Is I can almost guarantee you that the mono green Planeswalkers deck plays one copy of this in their sideboard to grab with Karn, because this is better than a lot of threats to grab with Karn. So
Yeah, it's a pretty good threat to get.
yeah, and I mean in a deck like that, or even in modern, it's pretty easy to get to 7 mana, to
Yeah,
actually kick it.
'cause
Now
I
it
mean,
like
and there's a good amount of cases where this is just better than Sky Sovereign.
oh absolutely, and I will say in modern Etron, like it's possible that this is better than some of the Eldrazi that you play, right? Like because you can just kick it pretty much for free in that deck, and it's
Yeah,
usually going to be a 6/6 or a 7/7 in modern.
yeah,
So they're not going to search out basics against Etron if they don't have to. So usually they're like unless they're worried about preserving their life total, usually it's going to be a 6/6 or a 7/7, sometimes an 8/8. So I think this card is fantastic just in general. So
yeah. It's
obviously
very deceptively, it can be easy to overlook, but there's definitely a lot of cases where this card can just be extremely powerful in of itself, which is, obviously a very good foil for a card. Because I mean, like, look at even Stonecoil Serpent. Like,
right.
it's an inconspicuous card where if it's a 1 mana 1/1, a 2 mana 2/2, 3 mana 3/3, but the fact that it's just so flexible and it can go into so many different decks, you know, kind of goes towards its power. And this kind of fits a similar mold where it's just good on its own.
Yeah, and I mean I think that's kind of the takeaway for me with the set is you have a lot of cards that are kind of just like good on their own, with the exception of a card like Forsaken Monument or Lithoform Engine. Most of the set I think is exemplified by these cards are good on their own, and mechanics like Kicker or the mechanics like the modal double face, which is the land thing, make it so these cards that are good on their own actually have far more variability to them, and I think that really showcases the dynamics of Kicker and other choice mechanics, and why they're really interesting to evaluate. So, there's a card like this it isn't as interesting if it doesn't have Kicker or that enters with plus counters when it's kicked. If it's just a 4/4 that makes 4/1/1s when your opponent targets it with the spell, well, that's still a good card, but is it as interesting? No. You lose a lot of late game potency with that card. It only fits into the 4-drop slot, So I love cards like this, and yeah, I mean this is a good card on 4. It's a good card on 7. It's exciting all around. So and yeah, I mean and that's kind of what I wanted to end on. So because we've been going for a while, and there's obviously like more we could say about these cards, and more cards we could talk about, and maybe we finish up the rest later. Um, but that's yeah. I mean that's a close to comprehensive view of the constructed playable cards. We skipped over all the commons and uncommons. Um, Part of that has to do with like a lot of their impact would be in terms of limited play like draft and sealed, which isn't as interesting right now, but um, you know but yeah, I mean covered a lot of interesting cards. um,
There's a lot of just really good, solid cards in the set. Um,
yeah, and we didn't even cover all of the good constructed playable rares. Like we didn't cover the inscriptions, you know we didn't cut
yeah,
like there was a lot we didn't cover.
there's a lot of good cards in this set that
Yeah,
you know, it's
it's I think it's good cards in the way that Core Set 21 gave us good cards, which is it that core set has a ton of constructed playable cards, but they're not
yep,
like broken Oko companion like
exactly.
level good. They're all role players, and some of them make new archetypes. Some of them make new sideboard options, but a lot of the set is playable, and it feels like this set follows in its footsteps in that regard. I would say most of the set is constructed playable. Is most of it constructed defining? I don't think so. But
Yep,
constructed playable,
I agree.
absolutely. I'm happier when a set has a lot of cards that I want to play as ones and two ofs in my decks rather than four ofs, because I don't think enough Magic players diversify their removal anyway, and I think giving players more choice with deck building is great. and sets like these I think really deliver on that mark. So yeah, I don't know. I'm excited to see the last 10 cards of the set, even though they're mostly just going to be limited filler, just because then I can get a full. Then I can actually fully commit to playtesting like I'm
Yeah,
doing tomorrow.
it'll be
So
good just to have the whole set, and then we can know what we're fully getting into. But
yeah,
it's exciting. It's good
hmm
to finally get back. Get to another set that's not like just be some crazy thing. Hopefully,
hopefully
knock on
party
wood.
isn't actually broken, or
That would be, oh my gosh, that'd be crazy
hopefully
if
none
there was.
of the things are broken.
Yeah, but yeah, it's a good set to start out a standard cycle on too.
Oh yeah.
So
All right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that does it for today. I am gonna be streaming tomorrow. My plan is to do. Um, I don't know if I'm gonna do standard playtesting or pioneer. I may do a mix of both, but I'm putting a deck dump of a bunch of decks up, like sometime in the afternoon tomorrow, um, on the Patreon and some in the Discord, and then uh, I'll probably just be focusing on pioneer. I feel because it's a format that I know more, right? Because obviously it's an unknown standard format, right? So it's more work to try and figure out like good lists and stuff like that, and the context of the format than in Pioneer, where we kind of have a lot of the information going in. So I may mostly focus on Pioneer tomorrow, but I'm definitely going to be streaming some playtesting. It's going to be on Cockatrice because it's not on Moto yet, um, or an Arena yet. So going to be looking to do some hours of that. So hopefully these cards are as fun to play with as they look. So because that would be
yeah,
nice.
should be a
So
good time. So
yep. All right. Well, thanks for coming on and chatting with me. I know like we both have
of
a
course,
tendency to
I know.
ramble and cut into each other and stuff. It's you and I don't have the same chemistry with that as Andrew and I do, where Andrew is a lot more patient about his word choices. You and I just love to ramble about magic. So it's nice to have
Yeah,
someone else that was like that, because earlier on I was like, I'm so used to when I do any sort of content where I have to talk all the time, or I have to like do all the heavy lifting. And it was nice that like there was a lot of times where like I could just drink my water or snack on something because you were just giving your thoughts. So it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot.
yeah, it's
So
good. So
all right. Well, that's gonna do it. So, all right. See ya.
later.